Chapter 690. With Chu Xiu's power, it was only a matter of time before he defeated Yan Huainan. If nothing unexpected happened in this battle, Chu Xiu had a 90% chance of winning. However, defeating a person and killing a person were two different situations. Now Chu Xiu had asked Mei Qinglian to attack together with him. Even though they had the upper hand, they still had to fight 2 against 1. It was obvious that they were prepared to kill Yan Huainan. Anyway, Chu Xiu's reputation in the underworld was extremely bad, so he was not afraid of people saying that he was immoral and ganging up on him. Fighting side by side was not something that only the righteous sex would do. Yan Huainan did not know Mei Qinglian. In fact, there were not many people in the underworld who knew Mei Qinglian. However, the power that Mei Qinglian had displayed was that of a genuine martial Dao master. Yan Huainan seemed to vaguely remember that when Chu Xiu had fought against the demon-killing alliance, this woman had made a move. She had even been able to hold back the Vajrayard's first seat of the Great Light Temple, Su Yan. Her power was extraordinary. In the current situation, if he were to be held back by Mei Qinglian, there would only be one ending waiting for him: death. At the thought of this, Yan Huainan immediately shouted angrily, "Taoist Wuyang! How long are you going to watch the show? I'm willing to join the Suppressing Martial Hall. I'll bring the Divine Martial Sect to the Suppressing Martial Hall, and help me stop Chu Xiu." Everyone present was stunned when they heard Yan Huainan's words. Join the Suppressing Martial Hall? Was Yan Huainan going to admit defeat? At that moment, a flash of sword light suddenly descended. An old man wearing a yin-yang impermanence Taoist robe descended from midair. The hilt of the long sword in his hand was pitch black, but the blade was scarlet. The long sword swept out, and the sword light was like a long tongue that swept away a large amount of Buddhist light. As the sword light swallowed and spat, the power of Chu Xiu's great sun-changing technique was constantly being weakened. Even if the power of Vairocana descended, its power would be greatly reduced. Therefore, Chu Xiu took the initiative to disperse the seal. He narrowed his eyes at the person before him and said coldly, "Taoist Wuyang, you have crossed the line." Taoist Wuyang looked leisurely at Chu Xiu and said, "Who said that? I have been acting in accordance with His Majesty's instructions, and secretly instigated some Jianghu martial artists to be used by our martial suppression hall. Now the Divine Martial Sect Master Yan is willing to join my subduing martial hall. What's wrong with this?" Actually, Taoist Wuyang's words were a little sophistry. Xiang Long's original intention was to let Chu Xiu deal with the Northern Yan martial arts forces. After all, this was what Chu Xiu had done in the Guanzhong torture room. He should be very familiar with it. Taoist Wuyang's goal was to secretly develop some loose cultivator martial artists who were not weak, and make them a member of the subduing martial hall. But in fact, Xiang Long did not say that he could only make a move against some loose cultivator martial artists. Now that Taoist Wuyang wanted to bring the Divine Martial Sect into the subduing martial hall, there was nothing wrong with that, provided that he could succeed. It should be said that the root of this matter was Xiang Long. He did not trust Taoist Wuyang and similarly did not trust Chu Xiu. Otherwise, he should have known that the subduing martial hall only had one steward, which was definitely more efficient than having 2. Not to mention that he should have known about the grudges between the Shadow Mountain sect and the Hidden Devil clan. In the end, he still brought Taoist Wuyang and Chu Xiu together. Chu Xiu stared at Taoist Wuyang and said coldly, "Let's not talk about these messy matters for now. The Divine Martial Sect wanted to poison me. I want an explanation for this matter. Is that wrong? Taoist Wuyang, don't forget which side you belong to now. Get out of the way. Otherwise, I will report you to His Majesty." Taoist Wuyang frowned. In fact, he was also cursing Yan Huainan in his heart. What the hell was wrong with this guy? He couldn't even control his own daughter. Originally, Taoist Wuyang did not want to appear in this matter. After all, Chu Xiu was also a member of the subduing martial hall. Killing each other from the subduing martial hall in front of outsiders would be a slap to Chu Xiu's face, as well as his own. If His Majesty found out, it would have an even worse impact. But now that Yan Huainan had already called out his name, he had no choice but to appear. Taoist Wuyang could only cough and say, "Chu Xiu, it is true that the Divine Martial Sect is in the wrong in this matter, but don't be so unforgiving. This matter has nothing to do with sect master Yin. It was all his daughter's doing. Don't worry about this. Even if the divine martial sect does not want to give you an explanation, I will give you one. A cold smile appeared on Chu Xiu's face. Taoist Wuyang, it seems that you still don't understand me. If I, Chu Xiu, want to kill someone, no one can stop me. If I can't kill him today, then I'll do it another day. If I can't kill him another day, then I'll look for an opportunity day and night. You can protect the divine martial sect for a while, but can you protect the divine martial sect forever? Besides, you don't know what you're talking about. What did you say just now? Give me an explanation? What a joke. What explanation do I, Chu Xiu, need from you? You're not fit to give me an explanation. Get lost. Otherwise I'll kill you as well. If Taoist Wuyang was still concerned about the subduing martial hall's reputation and the imperial court, then Chu Xiu really had no scruples. Without the subduing martial hall, Taoist Wuyang would have no place to stay. As for him, Chu Xiu, without the subduing martial hall, he could just continue to hang around in the Guanzhong torture room. Therefore he dared to turn against Taoist Wuyang without any scruples, but Taoist Wuyang didn't. However, under Chu Xiu's provocation, Taoist Wuyang was also enraged. He snorted coldly and said in a hoarse and gloomy tone, "When it's possible to let someone off, one should spare them. Chu Xiu, do you really not care about the subduing martial hall's reputation?" With a cold laugh, Chu Xiu took a step forward. The demonic aura on the heavenly demon dance in his hand surged, and it slashed down with a violent, ferocious aura. He had already turned against Taoist Wuyang long ago, so was there still a need to talk nonsense now? Taoist Wuyang frowned. He held the sword in his right hand, and the sinister long sword in his hand was filled with an eerie ghostly aura. When the sword was drawn, there was actually a faint wailing sound of ghosts. It was extremely sinister. Since Taoist Wuyang had made a move, Yan Huainan naturally couldn't just sit back and watch. He also rushed toward Chu Xiu, but he was stopped by Mei Qinglian. However, Yan Huainan didn't panic. With a wave of his hand, he ordered the disciples of the Divine Force sect to immediately attack Tangya and the others. This time, Chu Xiu was here to look for trouble, not to exterminate the sect. Therefore, he only brought Tangya and a dozen or so elites. Although each of them was an expert, and the weakest had the cultivation of 5 qis collecting in origin, this was the Divine Martial Sect, which was the opponent's home ground. In terms of numbers, they would definitely not be able to compete with the opponent. Therefore, they were at a disadvantage right from the start. At this moment, Yan Huainan also had a murderous intent. If he didn't kill Chu Xiu this time, Chu Xiu would probably kill him as well. Now that Chu Xiu's trusted subordinates were in danger, Yan Huainan didn't believe that Chu Xiu could still stay focused and maintain this combat strength. Moreover, Yan Huainan also believed in Taoist Wuyang's strength. Although Taoist Wuyang and Yan Huainan had not fought directly before, Taoist Wuyang was appointed by Xiang Long to be the general director of the subduing martial hall, on equal footing with Chu Xiu. This meant that Taoist Wuyang definitely had the qualifications to challenge Chu Xiu in terms of strength. Otherwise, the checks and balances would become a joke. In fact, this was indeed the case. Taoist Wuyang's cultivation method was indeed very evil. Even Chu Xiu was a little surprised by it. The sword light, which carried an eerie ghostly aura, was like a long tongue. It suddenly curled up and swallowed a portion of Chu Xiu's saber energy. In the end, the longsword actually left his hand, and was controlled by a grayish-white ghostly shadow to dance in midair. The sword light was eerie and eerie. Upon closer inspection, the ghostly shadow that was dancing the longsword actually looked like the legendary White Impermanence. Sword Dance of Impermanence, Yellow Springs of Misfortune. The techniques of the Shadow Mountain sect didn't lie between righteous and demonic, but between life and death. Chu Xiu frowned. He withdrew his saber and retreated, forming a Buddhist seal with his hands. He rapidly executed the 9 words formula of fast and slow. Blinding Buddhist light turned into 9 words wheels that smashed downwards. The powerful force shook the void, causing loud booms. The sword dance of impermanence was completely shattered by the 9 seals. However, the longsword in Taoist Wuyang's hand twisted, and the grayish-white Gang Qi instantly turned into a shadow that swallowed Chu Xiu. Upon closer inspection, it was actually the head of the Black Impermanence. It opened its mouth ferociously, wanting to swallow Chu Xiu whole. Moreover, the suction force was extremely strong. Everywhere it passed, even the spiritual qi of the world was sucked dry. However, at this moment, a figure suddenly appeared behind Taoist Wuyang. It opened its mouth wide and swallowed him as well. Moreover, the suction force was much stronger than the power of the Black Impermanence, and it also carried an extremely strong sense of evil. Taoist Wuwang turned his head and saw the avatar of the hungry ghost Taoist trying to devour him. Taoist Wuwang was instantly shocked. Hungry ghost essence. Taoist Wuyang then said angrily, "Is this how the hungry ghost essence is used? What a waste of God's gift." The techniques of the Shadow Mountain sect mainly focused on the Tao of life and death. Among them, the Tao of death contained many methods to refine ferocious ghosts. However, most of them had been lost. Even if some were not lost, they basically had extremely harsh conditions and could not be easily refined. There were many ways to use the hungry ghost essence. For Chu Xiu to only use it to its most basic effect, what else could it be other than a waste of God's gift? However, Taoist Wuyang did not have time to think so much. In the instant that the hungry ghost realm's incarnation attacked, Taoist Wuyang formed a seal with his hands. Instantly, a large amount of spiritual qi of the world fused into his seal. His aura seemed to have transformed into a giant tree that reached the heavens, constantly growing with boundless vitality. In the instant that the hungry ghost essence devoured Taoist Wuyang and the giant tree, the hungry ghost essence suddenly exploded. The powerful force of life immediately caused it to quickly retreat back into the human puppet, as if it had suffered a great injury. However, at this moment, a blinding Buddhist light suddenly burst out from behind Taoist Wuyang. Taoist Wuyang's Black Impermanence was directly shattered by Chu Xiu's great art of changing the sun. Chu Xiu himself walked towards Taoist Wuyang, the demonic aura around him condensing into Buddhist light. His aura was vast and powerful, and he directly crushed towards Taoist Wuyang. Chapter 691. Chu Xiu had not expected this Taoist Wuyang to be so strong. Although he had not reached the level of Chu Wuji, he was definitely an expert amongst martial arts masters. Although the Shade Mountain sect's cultivation method was considered by the Taoist lineage to be demonic, they actually cultivated in the orthodox way of life and death, the secret technique of yin and yang. Under the power of the great art of changing sun, Chu Xiu pressed forward step by step. Under that power, all evil spirits and demons were melted and destroyed. Even the ghastly longsword in Taoist Wuyang's hand began to show a crack. Taoist Wuyang's expression changed slightly. With a flick of the horsetail whisk in his left hand, a misty life force bloomed and wrapped around Chu Xiu. Just as Chu Xiu was about to move, the ground suddenly cracked. Towering trees suddenly emerged from the ground, as if they had grown in an instant, brimming with life force. Chu Xiu's figure moved, using the heavens sun-gazing at air technique. As long as there was any movement on the ground, he would be able to dodge in advance. Interesting. A strange look appeared in Chu Xiu's eyes. The Shade Mountain sect's cultivation method was truly interesting. It could actually fuse life and death into one. Taoist Wuyang's move was clearly a sign that he had studied the power of life force to its limits. Chu Xiu had once heard Mei Qinglian describe the Shade Mountain sect in detail. It was said that when the Shade Mountain sect was still a Taoist lineage, he had once performed this move in front of everyone. With a wave of his hand, a small sapling would grow into a towering tree. Once a seed fell to the ground, it would instantly grow into a fruitful fruit tree. Passers-by could pluck it, and people would even worship him as if he were an immortal. However, this move of Taoist Wuyang's was not a performance. It was a genuine killing move. Using his own strength to forcefully grow so many trees, Taoist Wuyang's originally unsightly face now turned even paler. Most importantly, the densely packed trees did not even touch the side of Chu Xiu. Just as everyone thought that Taoist Wuyang's strength was lacking, Taoist Wuyang suddenly formed a hand seal and spat out a single word: suppress. In an instant, countless towering trees blossomed with the brilliance of the formation and connected into one. Chu Xiu happened to be at the very center of the formation. Even Chu Xiu himself did not expect that he would fall into Daoist Wu Yang's trap. His opponent knew that he could dodge his giant tree, but he still did so. In the end, he forced him to the center of the formation, where he had to bear the most pressure. In an instant, the array formation exploded. The towering trees began to wither and finally exploded. The ultimate life force was death. The moment the formation exploded, the entire divine martial gate trembled. The power was so strong that it could kill most of the martial Dao grandmasters in an instant. Daoist Wu Yang let out a long sigh. In truth, he had no intention of killing Chu Xiu. After all, he and Chu Xiu were both in charge of the subduing martial hall. It would be hard to explain himself to His Majesty if he were to kill each other for the sake of an outsider from the gate of divine might. Therefore, if Chu Xiu had given him the slightest bit of face, this matter would have been easily resolved. However, this Chu Xiu was stubborn and refused to budge, shedding all pretenses of cordiality the moment they met. In that case, he could not be blamed for being ruthless. Although Daoist Wu Yang had caused such a huge commotion, those who were on Chu Xiu's side, be it Mei Qinglian or Tang Ye, were not worried. They had followed Chu Xiu for such a long time, and had witnessed countless crises that had befallen Chu Xiu. Even when facing Divine Lord Luo of the Sky Gates, Chu Xiu, a powerhouse at the refinement of true fire realm, had not died. It was basically impossible for Daoist Wu Yang to kill Chu Xiu. Indeed, in the next moment, there were some changes in the array formation that had exploded. A shocking power emerged and the power of the array formation's explosion began to disperse to both sides. A flash of saber light bloomed, and the extreme sharpness of the saber caused many of the warriors present to be unable to open their eyes. The terrifying saber fell. The saber intent surged and the saber force surged. The saber force was vast and surging, like a tsunami tearing the heavens and splitting the earth, drowning and devouring all things. Devouring heaven and earth 7 limits, breaking the sea. Chu Xiu rarely used this martial technique. Even when he was at the one with the world realm, Chu Xiu would never use this move unless he was in a critical situation. This saber technique drew upon the power of the heavens and earth. Even powerful existences like the 7 demon saber were created by imitating this saber technique. When Chu Xiu was at the one with the world realm, the backlash from using this saber technique was too great. It was so great that he would no longer be able to fight after using it once. Although the backlash from using it now was not small, at least Chu Xiu now had a basic level of control over it. He would no longer be in such a sorry state like when he was at the one with the world realm. The moment Chu Xiu slashed out with his saber, Daoist Wu Yang's expression changed. He could feel the power of this saber. It was an extreme power that could not be blocked. The horsetail whisk in his hand danced wildly, and the power of life, death, and Yin blossomed before him. The misty power of life intertwined with the ghostly aura of death, turning into the black and white impermanence, just like the pattern on his Daoist robe. Their heads and tails were connected as they stood in front of him. At the same time, Daoist Wu Yang retreated quickly, bursting forth with extreme speed. He ran as far as he could. However, what happened next was beyond everyone's expectations. When Chu Xiu's saber descended, it was not aimed at the panicking Daoist Wu Yang, but at Yan Huainan, who was still fighting with Mei Qinglian. When the saber descended, even Yan Huainan himself did not realize that Chu Xiu's target was actually him. Mei Qinglian's figure moved, and the black fog dissipated. In a flash, her figure had already appeared several tens of feet away. Yan Huainan was suddenly faced with the power of Chu Xiu's saber. Between life and death, Yan Huainan let out an enraged roar. Boundless qi and blood burst forth from his body as he tried to block the attack with all his might. However, in his haste, it was all for naught. The name of the sea-cleaving saber was not an exaggeration. It truly possessed the power to cleave through the sea. It was a mighty power that no human could touch. Everything dissipated under that saber strike. Yan Huainan's body was cleaved into 2, and he fell to the ground with a loud crash. A fissure began to extend beneath the feet of his corpse, spanning several hundred feet. At the end of the fissure, many palaces collapsed with a loud rumble. Everyone present was immediately dumbfounded. They had never imagined that things would end up like this. Chu Xiu and Daoist Wuyang were in a heated battle, but in the end, Yan Huainan had been killed. What was going on? A hint of anger appeared on Daoist Wuyang's face, and the power of the black and white impermanence before him dissipated. Chu Xiu's actions made him feel like he had been played. However, at that moment, before the others could make a move, a slightly pale Chu Xiu suddenly appeared in front of Yan Tingting, who was still in a daze. Yan Tingting's eyes were filled with intense hatred as she looked at Chu Xiu. However, before she could say a single word, Chu Xiu stretched out his hand like lightning and grabbed her neck. After strangling her to death, he threw her to the side. Everyone present shuddered at the sight of this. Previously, they had always heard that Chu Xiu was vicious and merciless, and that he was too ruthless in doing things. However, they had never had a direct understanding of how vicious Chu Xiu was. Now they finally saw it. Vicious, truly vicious. He was so vicious that he did not even give his opponent a chance to say anything vicious before he died. Daoist Wuyang looked at Chu Xiu and said through gritted teeth, "Chu Xiu, you're very good. We'll see the results in front of His Majesty." After he finished speaking, Daoist Wuyang waved his hand and left with the people of the Shade Mountain sect. Yan Huainan was already dead. What was the point of him fighting to the death with Chu Xiu? Moreover, he had seen Chu Xiu's strength. Whether or not he could defeat Chu Xiu, it was impossible for him to kill Chu Xiu. However, he had planned for such a long time. He was about to make Yan Huainan bring the entire Divine Martial Sect to join the subduing Martial Hall and become his subordinates. However, Chu Xiu had messed up his plans. This matter was definitely not over. Chu Xiu glanced at the surroundings. The disciples of the Divine Martial Sect who had been besieging Tangya, and the others had already fled in all directions. When the people from the martial arts circle saw Chu Xiu's gaze, they subconsciously took a step back. A chill rose from the bottom of their hearts. Chu Xiu did not say much. He just waved his hand and left with Tangya and the others. It was not that he did not want to destroy the Divine Martial Sect along the way, but it was purely an accident that he had brought too few people with him. After all, the Divine Martial Sect had tens of thousands of disciples in the inner and outer sections. It was basically impossible for him to destroy the Divine Martial Sect with only a dozen people. Even tens of thousands of pigs would not stand there and let him catch them. Moreover, after using the sea-cleaving saber, Chu Xiu had consumed too much energy. It was not appropriate for him to attack again for the time being. In order to prevent accidents, it was better for him to go back and recuperate for a while. In less than half a day, the news that Chu Xiu had killed Yan Huainan in the Divine Martial Sect had spread throughout the northern Yan martial arts circle, causing everyone to be shocked. Yan Huainan was not like Feng Datong, who was ranked in the top 50 on the ranking list. The Divine Martial Sect was also one of the 7 sects and 8 schools because of him. However, he had died at the hands of Chu Xiu. This was somewhat shocking. Moreover, those who knew the cause and effect of this matter could not say anything to Chu Xiu. After all, it was the Divine Martial Sect who had poisoned Chu Xiu in the beginning. In the end, the despicable method did not work, and they deserved to be killed instead. Even the Great Guangming Temple could not find any fault with this. Although it was not Yan Huainan who had poisoned Yan Huainan, what was the difference between poisoning your daughter and poisoning you? However, even though it was like this, everyone was still shocked by Chu Xiu's strength and viciousness. This fellow was simply like a malefic star. Wherever he went, he would kill, and he especially liked to send people off on some joyous occasions. Originally, some of the martial arts circles were preparing to hold birthday parties or celebrations. However, after this incident, all of them were cancelled. Chapter 692. In the dim hall, Xiang Long looked angrily at Daoist Wuyang and Chu Xiu below. "I handed the martial suppression hall to you, and this is how you repay me? Killing each other? The others haven't done anything yet, but you're already fighting each other, making a joke out of yourselves. One of you is a sect master, and the other is the successor of the Yinma clan. Both of you are martial arts masters. Don't you have any sense of the bigger picture?" Following Xiang Long's angry shout, Daoist Wuyang explained, "Your Majesty, please understand. This humble Taoist has been quietly instigating Yan Huainan to rebel against us. In the end, just as I was about to succeed, this Chu Xiu suddenly intervened and caused the matter to fail. This Chu Xiu is clearly using his position to take revenge. Chu Xiu said indifferently, I'm using my position to take revenge? What a joke! You and I are both from the Martial Suppression Hall, but when did you tell me about your actions against Yan Huainan? Yan Huainan was one of the participants when the Northern Yan formed the demon-slaying alliance. Why? Is it wrong for me to find trouble with him now? Taoist Wuyang snorted coldly and said, Then why did you still try to kill Yan Huainan after I showed up? Chu Xiu did not budge an inch. What a joke. Yan Huainan wanted to kill me. He wanted to kill me, so I killed him. What's wrong with that? The one who killed you is Yan Huainan's daughter, not Yan Huainan. All right then. I'll send someone to poison Taoist Wuyang with the gut-severing parasite, and then kill that person to give you an explanation. Then this matter will have nothing to do with me, right? You're twisting words and forcing logic. As Chu Xiu and Taoist Wuyang argued, their anger grew. If it weren't for the fact that they were in the imperial palace, they would have easily picked up their weapons and fought each other. Shut up, both of you. Xianglong shouted angrily and said, All right, let's forget about this matter for now. Both of you take a step back and don't look for trouble with each other. If I find out that the two of you are doing this again, I will definitely punish you severely. With that, Xianglong waved his sleeves and chased both of them out. After Chu Xiu and Taoist Wuyang left, the fury on Xianglong's face suddenly disappeared. The speed at which his expression changed was unimaginable. An old eunuch hidden in the shadows stood behind Xianglong and said in a low, hoarse voice, Did His Majesty let them go so easily? The people of the pugilistic world are the people of the pugilistic world. They have no rules, and their wild nature is hard to tame. Xianglong waved his hand and said, No matter. The matters of the pugilistic world should be settled by the people of the pugilistic world. Otherwise, why would we invite Taoist Wuyang and Chu Xiu here? I don't care about the process, I only care about the results. No matter how fiercely they fight, as long as they don't threaten the interests of the Northern Yan, it's fine. Eunuch Han, have there been any changes in the pugilistic world since the establishment of the Zhenwu Hall? Eunuch Han thought about it and said, The changes are quite big. At present, the Great Light Temple and other top Northern Yan sects have been attracted to West Chu. With Chu Xiu taking control of the giant spirit gang, and annexing more than 10 Northern Yan pugilistic world forces, the other pugilistic world forces are all in danger, and don't dare to be too insolent. Xianglong waved his hand and said, Isn't that enough? Who cares if they fight to the death? As long as they can subdue the Northern Yan pugilistic world, that's enough. The Shenwu Gate is a big Northern Yan sect, and usually doesn't accept the imperial rule. Whether Yan Huainan dies or submits, it's beneficial to the imperial court of the Northern Yan. If that's the case, why should we care so much? Eunuch Han lowered his head and didn't say much. His Majesty's thoughts were not something he could casually guess. In short, if His Majesty thinks it's good, then it must be good. After leaving the palace, Chu Xiu and Taoist Wuyang both turned around and left on bad terms. Although Xianglong didn't punish anyone in the end, the one who suffered the most was Taoist Wuyang. From the moment Chu Xiu started to attack the giant spirit gang, Taoist Wuyang had already used the item left behind by the Shenwu Gate's ancestor to instigate Yan Huainan to defect. He was just one step away from success, but in the end, Chu Xiu ruined it. This was quite unbearable. After returning to the Zhenwu Hall, Chu Xiu sorted out the recent affairs of the Zhenwu Hall in detail. There was nothing special that needed to be dealt with. The Great Light Temple's attention was no longer on the Northern Yan side. Other sects like the Huangfu clan and the Northern Fluttering Snow City were also playing it safe and didn't come looking for trouble. Therefore, Chu Xiu was also preparing to head to Wei Prefecture. Chu Xiu didn't bring too many people with him during his trip to Wei Prefecture. He only brought along Tangya and a dozen of his trusted subordinates with decent strength. As for Mei Qinglian, she stayed behind in the Zhenwu Hall. Mei Qinglian wasn't interested in things like sword arts. She just instructed Chu Xiu to not forget to give her a share if he obtained any good stuff. In Wei Prefecture's Tongzhou Prefecture, Chu Xiu was walking on the streets of the Tongzhou Prefecture with a rather complicated mood. This was the place where he started his career, and also the place where he had to conceal many secrets. For example, his cheap father's identity as a dragon rider imperial guard. Even if it was found out, he didn't have to worry. With Chu Xiu's current status and identity, he didn't have to be afraid of what the Eastern Qi imperial court would do. Moreover, he had a good relationship with the second prince of Eastern Qi. According to Chu Xiu's information before he arrived, Azure Water Sword sect had been completely destroyed. Lu Gongyuan was dead, Shenbai was dead, and Dou Guangchen led a group of Azure Water Sword sect elites to die in the hands of Chu Xiu in the Xiaofan Heaven. The entire Azure Water Sword sect was completely ruined. It could be said that the entire Azure Water Sword sect's downfall was definitely related to Chu Xiu. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he single-handedly destroyed Azure Water Sword sect. Now that Azure Water Sword sect was one of the 7 sects and 8 factions that were eliminated, it was rather simple for Chu Xiu to visit and interrogate them. But when Chu Xiu brought his men to the Azure Water Sword sect's mountain gate, he felt something was amiss. There were too many people at the foot of Azure Water Sword sect's mountain. A dense crowd of martial artists were gathered here. From the looks of it, there were not only Northern Yan martial artists, but also Eastern Qi martial artists. Seeing this scene, Chu Xiu immediately frowned. What happened to Azure Water Sword sect? Why did so many people come? But when the others saw Chu Xiu coming, they were even more surprised than Chu Xiu. It's Chu Xiu. He actually came here too. That's not surprising. After all, Chu Xiu was the one who killed Azure Water Sword sect's Shenbai. It's normal for him to discover something. I heard that Chu Xiu ran amok in the Northern Yan land and killed so many people that blood flowed like a river. Is there any brother from the Northern Yan land who can tell us about the situation? Amidst the crowd's discussion, Chu Xiu walked straight to the Azure Water Sword sect's mountain gate. When he reached the peak, he realized there were even more martial artists here, and they were all from the major sections. Most of them were from the sword sects, with the 5 major sword sects as the leaders. Chu Xiu could recognize quite a few of them. Among them were Concealed Sword Villa's Edgeless Sword Cheng Tingfeng, Forgetting Sword Hut's Vacant Sword, Han Tingyi. One of them was dressed like a martial artist from Storm Sword Tomb, but Chu Xiu didn't recognize him. Seeing Chu Xiu's arrival, the crowd looked at Chu Xiu and frowned, not showing any good expressions. Right at this moment, a voice suddenly came from behind Chu Xiu. Brother Chu, why are you here? You are a saber user. What are you doing here? Chu Xiu turned around and saw Feng Qixiao carrying his sword on his shoulder. On one side of the sword, there was a roasted chicken wrapped in oil paper, and on the other side of the sword hilt were 2 wine gourds. The long sword that 7th young Master Feng was carrying was slightly different from his previous long swords. The hilt and scabbard of the sword were both azure in color, and emitted a cold, eerie light. Even before it was unsheathed, one could already feel that it was different. Chu Xiu heard the news before. Because Feng Qixiao was promoted to the 2nd rank of the Dragon Tiger rankings, the Sword King City gave the divine weapon, the Divine Sword Awakening Salamander, to Feng Qixiao in advance. Chu Xiu looked around and Feng Qixiao asked curiously, Brother Chu, what are you looking at? I'm seeing if the rest of the people from Sword King City are here. If they see you insulting the divine sword, they'll probably beat you up so badly that you won't even be able to drink. Feng Qixiao chuckled and said, Since they gave it to me, it's still my sword even if it's broken. Anyway, it's my sword. I can use it however I want. It's none of their business. As he spoke, Feng Qixiao threw a wine gourd to Chu Xiu and said, I forgot to say this. Congratulations on becoming a martial Dao Grandmaster. Don't forget that at least part of the credit goes to me. Feng Qixiao was talking about the fair fight between him and Chu Xiu when the Eastern Qi alliance besieged him. But in fact, that fight only increased Chu Xiu's understanding of the heaven's sun gazing at air a little. Chu Xiu should thank Divine Lord Luo the most for being able to become a martial Dao Grandmaster. Seeing Chu Xiu looking at him, Feng Qixiao spread his hands and said, Fine, not a part, but at least a little, right? Chu Xiu didn't answer. He just opened the wine gourd and took a sip saying, Didn't you get punished after returning to Sword King City last time? And why are you here? Didn't the people from Sword King City come with you? Feng Qishao opened the roasted chicken, broke off a drumstick, and handed it to Chu Xiu, saying, "Of course I didn't get punished. Do you think those old guys are willing to punish me? But after you and Zhang Qingjin stepped into the martial Dao Grandmaster realm consecutively, those old guys are a little anxious. Even if they can't compete with you and Zhang Qingjin, they can't fall below the 3rd rank. They also know that it is useless to lock me up all day, so they let me out and let me search for opportunities and inspiration to step into the martial Dao Grandmaster realm." Chu Xiu took a glance at Feng Qishao's hand that was holding the drumstick. He didn't take it but tore off another drumstick from the roasted chicken. Feng Qishao curled his lips and said, "Pretentious. You haven't said, why are you here at Azure Wave Sword Sect? Also, what are these guys doing here?" Chu Xiu took a bite of the drumstick and looked at Cheng Tingfeng and the others. Feng Qishao asked in surprise, "Why? Aren't you here for the treasure left behind by Azure Wave Sword Sect? It is said that Shenbai obtained that treasure, which is why he has the strength to challenge you." Hearing this, Chu Xiu immediately frowned and subconsciously exerted force in his hand. The drumstick was shattered by the trace of dipper qi that he accidentally leaked out. Feng Qishao curled his lips again and said, "What a waste of food." Chapter 693. Regarding the Azure Water Sword Sect and Shenbai's matter, Chu Xiu thought that no one else noticed. But the truth was as such. After that incident, the Azure Water Sword Sect was never safe and sound. Why did it seem like everyone knew about this matter now? After Chu Xiu asked Feng Qishao, he finally understood what was going on. This made Chu Xiu have the urge to curse. At the start, no one noticed the secret of the Azure Water Sword Sect's back mountain, and no one paid attention to it. In fact, the one who leaked this secret was the Azure Water Sword Sect itself. After Shenbai's death, the Azure Water Sword Sect was like a group of dragons without a leader. They didn't even have a sect master. The older generation of disciples were all dead, and the elite disciples of the middle generation followed Dou Guangqian and died in the hands of Chu Xiu. Hence, the Azure Water Sword Sect was only left with some of the weaker disciples. Even though the Azure Water Sword Sect was removed from the 7 sects and 8 factions, but in the eyes of some people, it still had some value. For example, the Azure Water Sword Sect's mountain was actually not bad, and was a treasured land. Hence, there were some forces from the Wei County, and even the northern Yan and eastern Qi regions that invaded the Azure Water Sword Sect in hopes of seizing the Azure Water Sword Sect. The remaining Azure Water Sword Sect disciples panicked. Facing the hungry wolves, they started to threaten them. No one knew who said it, but the Azure Water Sword Sect still had a trump card. It was their back mountain ancestral ground. As long as they walked out of it, they would definitely achieve great success. Shenbai was an example. If they were provoked, they would let the ancestors who were in seclusion in the ancestral ground to kill them all. This news was initially used to scare people. It was half true and half false, but it did scare off a lot of people. These disciples didn't know the true secret of the Azure Water Sword Sect, but they were still members of the Azure Water Sword Sect, and had heard of some legends. Moreover, Shenbai's seclusion couldn't be hidden from others. However, when this news completely spread to the ears of some people, they felt that something was wrong. If the Azure Water Sword Sect really had such an ancestral ground, why didn't anyone cultivate Shenbai's sword skills? Previously, they all thought that it was Shenbai's fated encounter alone, but from the looks of it now, could it be that the fated encounter was still within the Azure Water Sword Sect? The words of these Azure Water Sword Sect disciples might be half true and half false, but through the clues in their words, they were able to deduce something. The Azure Water Sword Sect was probably hiding some good stuff. That was why the various sects, especially the sword sects, had sent people to investigate. Regardless of whether it was true or not, at the very least, there had to be some results. That was how the scene he was seeing now had come to an end. After understanding all of this, Chu Xiu was also rather depressed. He was still too late. If he had acted earlier, the secret of the Azure Water Sword Sect would have been monopolized by him. In fact, from the start, Chu Xiu had already sensed that something was wrong with Shenbai and the Azure Water Sword sect. It was just that he had sent people to scout for information, and the Azure Water Sword sect didn't attract the attention of other martial artists. In addition, Xiang Long from the Northern Yan side was pressuring him. That was why he was prepared to settle things with the Northern Yan side before coming to Wei County. He didn't expect the news to be leaked. Fang Qi-xiao, who was at the side, saw that Chu Xiu's expression wasn't looking good. He decisively didn't say anything else and just drank his wine. In the past, with his strength, he could still exchange a few moves with Chu Xiu, but now he really couldn't beat him. It was better not to talk too much, or else he might get beaten up. But he didn't say anything. Chu Xiu instead asked, "Then what is the situation now? Has anyone found the Azure Water Sword sect's so-called treasure?" Fang Qi-xiao shook his head and said, "If one faction came, then they would definitely find it. But now that so many factions have come, you have also seen it. Everyone wants to monopolize it, but the result is a stalemate here. In the beginning, only the Forgetting Sword Hut and Storm Sword Tomb came first, but the longer they dragged it out, the more people came. Let's see if this drags on. Who knows how many more people will come." In fact, when they saw Chu Xiu coming, the factions already felt that they couldn't drag it out any longer. If this dragged on, there really wouldn't be enough. But everyone was still thinking, what should they do in this situation? Just as they were pondering, there were quite a number of people who also followed up the mountain. They were all Eastern Qi, Northern Yan, and other nearby factions. Among them, there were also people from the Shangyang Mo clan. Seeing Chu Xiu, Mo Tianlin came over with some guilt and said, "Brother Chu, last time I wasn't able to persuade the patriarch to help. I am sorry." Chu Xiu waved his hand and said, "Brother Mo doesn't need to take it to heart. You already helped me a lot by not letting the Mo clan hit me when I was down. People in the pugilistic world can't help themselves. I understand." As he spoke, Chu Xiu pointed to Fang Qi-xiao, who was still gnawing on the roast chicken, and said, "Look at him, he doesn't have any sense of guilt. In this life, you don't have to let anyone down. As long as you don't let yourself down, that is enough." Fang Qi-xiao wiped the oily corners of his mouth and raised his head in a daze. Why was he involved again? "Brother Mo, do you want to have a bite?" Tongzhou Prefecture's honey roast chicken. The taste is very good. Fang Qi-xiao offered his half-eaten roast chicken forward. Mo Tianlin took a step back, shook his head decisively and said, "No need, Brother Fang, you can enjoy it yourself." In fact, among these people, only the seemingly indifferent Chu Xiu and the seemingly unruly Fang Qi-xiao understood what was going on. During the battle, Fang Qi-xiao understood that he was friends with Chu Xiu, so he did his best to help Chu Xiu. Even if he didn't do his best, he had a clear conscience and was extremely benevolent. At the very least, he didn't let down his own conscience. After all, he was a disciple of Sword King City and had been nurtured by Sword King City. He couldn't risk his life for Chu Xiu or even betray the sect. Fang Qi-xiao had done everything he could, and that was enough. So when he saw Chu Xiu again, he felt very natural. Although Sword King City didn't have a good relationship with Chu Xiu, it didn't prevent Fang Qi-xiao from continuing to treat Chu Xiu as a friend. Chu Xiu looked at Mo Tianlin and said, "Didn't your Mo family send a martial Dao grandmaster this time?" Mo Tianlin shook his head and said, "My Mo family isn't strong, and the only martial Dao grandmaster is the family's old ancestor. He won't participate in this kind of occasion. So my Mo family only sent a few oneness of heaven and man cultivators. They're mainly here to watch the show. I just broke through, so I wanted to come out to relax and consolidate my cultivation." Chu Xiu had already noticed that Mo Tianlin had also stepped into the oneness of heaven and man realm. It might not be easy for Mo Tianlin to step into the oneness of heaven and man realm at his age, but in front of Chu Xiu and Fang Qi-xiao, he really couldn't be proud. "Are the members of the 5 major sword sects here?" Chu Xiu looked at Fang Qi-xiao and asked. Fang Qi-xiao wiped his mouth and said, "More or less. After all, the sword skill that Shenbai displayed back then was indeed extraordinary. If that inheritance is truly in the Azure Water Sword sect, it is still worth a trip. Therefore, Storm Sword Tomb, Forgetful Sword Hut, and Concealed Sword Villa each sent a grandmaster. I just happened to be nearby, so the sect sent me here. What Feng Qixiao meant was that he might be at the oneness of heaven and man realm, but he was comparable to a martial Dao grandmaster. Of course, when Feng Qixiao said this, he was just narrating and not showing off. To Feng Qixiao, he might show off his wit, his handsomeness, but he wouldn't show off his strength. What he said earlier was just a fact. The members of the Yu Palace didn't come? Chu Xiu was astonished. Feng Qixiao shook his head and said, "Who knows? The Yu Palace has been declining for the past few years. That woman, Lin Fengya, has a stubborn personality. The other 5 major sword sects don't wish to have any dealings with her. Seeing that she is a woman, we don't wish to lower ourselves to her level. Yan Fian isn't bad. That woman isn't easy to deal with either. She might be beautiful, but her strength is lacking. I reckon she won't come." Although Yan Fian was also ranked in the top 10 of the Longhu leaderboard, and had also reached the oneness of heaven and man realm, her strength was clearly still lacking compared to an existence at Feng Qixiao's level. On the other hand, Feng Qixiao and Zhong Xian already had the strength to fight a martial Dao grandmaster head-on. At this moment, Feng Qixiao suddenly thought of something. He suddenly said, "But I heard a rumor from the other disciples of Sword King City. They said that brother Lu Fengxian is together with that woman, Yan Fian." Chu Xiu was stunned, then he shook his head and said, "Impossible. With the Yu Palace's rules, Yan Fian won't be with anyone." Back then, Ing Bailu pursued Yan Fian, but she didn't agree. How could she be with brother Lu now? Do you think she's a woman who can put aside her reason for love? Chu Xiu didn't say this because he doubted Lu Fengxian's strength and charm. He just didn't believe that Yan Fian would be with a man, even if that man was a young talent like Lu Fengxian, who had a limitless future. In Yan Fian's heart, the most important thing would always be the sect. Back then, Ing Bailu had pursued her for a long time and was extremely infatuated with her. In the end, Yan Fian still cruelly rejected him. From this point, one could see Yan Fian's thoughts and character. But now Feng Qixiao said that Lu Fengxian was with Yan Fian. This was a bit ridiculous. Although in Chu Xiu's opinion, Lu Fengxian's future achievements might even surpass Ing Bailu's, in the eyes of others, the current Ing Bailu was undoubtedly far more outstanding than Lu Fengxian. Feng Qixiao chuckled and said, "Who can say for sure about something like love?" Chu Xiu glanced at him and said, "What do you know about love? Besides coming into contact with women in brothels, when have you ever touched a woman?" Feng Qixiao wanted to refute, but he was really speechless by Chu Xiu's words. In all fairness, although Feng Qixiao wasn't considered handsome, he wasn't ugly either. In addition, he was the successor of Sword King City, and a top swordsman of the younger generation. He should be very popular with women. However, his mouth was really too damaging to his image. Basically, no woman was willing to chat with him. They would be angered to death. Mo Tianlin sighed and said, "I asked the world what love is." Before he could finish his sentence, Chu Xiu said indifferently, "I'm more familiar with this poem than you are. Also, didn't you get dumped by a woman? Do you understand what is called emotion and what is love?" Mo Tianlin was also speechless by Chu Xiu's words. However, he suddenly saw something. He suddenly pointed down the mountain and said in surprise, "Brother Chu, look." Chapter 694. Chu Xiu was still discussing the matter of Lu Fengxian and Yan Fian with Feng Qixiao and Mo Tianlin when a group of people came up the mountain. Most of them were sword-wielding women. They were Yan Fian and the Yu Palace's martial artists. There was only one man, Lu Fengxian. Seeing this, Chu Xiu frowned slightly. Was it true? At this time, Lu Fengxian also saw Chu Xiu and the others. He immediately came over and greeted them with a smile. "Brother Chu, Brother Feng, Brother Mo, you're early." After greeting each other, Chu Xiu looked at the Yu Palace's people and said to Lu Fengxian, "Brother Lu, you're together with Miss Yan?" LV Fengxian nodded naturally and said, "Yes." To Lu Fengxian, it was normal for a man and a woman to be in love. He just had to admit it openly. Chu Xiu frowned and said, "But what about the Yu Palace's rules? You should know that the Yu Palace's disciples will never marry outside. Not to mention that Yan Fian is the next successor of the Yu Palace." Lu Fengxian smiled and said, I know this. That's why Fian said that she's only with me in name now. After she helps the Yu Palace overcome their difficulties and chooses a suitable successor, she will let the Yu Palace expel her from the sect. Then she will be with me officially and marry me. Hearing Lu Fengxian say this, not only Chu Xiu, but also Feng Qishao and Mo Tianlin at the side frowned. Then during this time, you've been helping Yan Fian in the Yu Palace? Lu Fengxian nodded and said, the Yu Palace's palace mistress Lin Fengya has yet to recover from her injuries. Some shameless and filthy people wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to bully the women, but I stopped them. What about Shui Wuxiang and the others? He's not with you? I asked them to stay at the Yu Maiden Palace to help out. It just so happens that the 5 major sword sects are participating in the Azure Water Sword Sects incident. Palace Mistress Lin isn't able to come, and Fei Yan's strength isn't enough. Hence, I accompanied her. Everyone chatted here for a while. The Yu Palace seemed to have something to discuss, so Lu Fengxian was called back by Yan Fian. Chu Xiu raised his eyebrows and said, everyone, what do you think? Feng Qishao snorted lightly and said, I'll see with my own eyes. In any case, I don't believe that woman Yan Fian would let her sect expel her from the Yu Palace for a man. Moreover, with her talent and strength, would the Yu Palace let her go? Mo Tianlin just smiled bitterly and said, could it be that love can really make people dizzy? Brother Liu doesn't seem to be an irrational person. Chu Xiu didn't say anything. He felt that Lu Fengxian's behavior was very normal. In fact, Lu Fengxian was good in every aspect, but she was too gullible. Chu Xiu firmly believed that humans were evil by nature, so he would often use the greatest evil to speculate on a person. But Lu Fengxian was the exact opposite. He believed that humans were good by nature. As long as you didn't reveal any evil intentions towards him, he would treat you with the greatest sincerity. In the original storyline, Lu Fengxian was deceived by Nie Donglu. In the end, if it wasn't for Lu Fengxian's astounding luck and opportunities, she would probably have been tricked to death. It was the same now. Chu Xiu might not be able to say that Yan Fian was tricking Lu Fengxian, but in his opinion, this matter definitely wasn't that simple. The Yu Palace was currently in a state of decline. Lin Fengya was injured. Although Yan Fian's strength wasn't bad, it was only not bad. It was far from the level of a martial Dao grandmaster. But Lu Fengxian was different. With an unparalleled divine weapon and Lu Wenho's inheritance, he could completely rival a martial Dao grandmaster. With Lu Fengxian around, he could help the Yu Palace tide over this crisis for the time being. At this moment, Mo Tianlin suddenly said doubtfully, if Yan Fian was using Brother Liu, then why didn't she go finding Bailu? Be it in terms of strength or background, Bailu is above Brother Liu. Actually, strength aside, the two of them hadn't fought directly before. But in terms of background, the Shang Shuai clan definitely had an advantage over Lu Fengxian, who was all alone. If Yan Fian only wanted to use Lu Fengxian to tide over the Yu Palace's crisis, then Bailu was actually a better choice than Lu Fengxian. After all, the former had been in love with Yan Fian for a long time. He didn't even need to show up. As long as the Shang Shuai clan said the word, those rascals would naturally retreat. Chu Xiu shook his head and said, I don't know. But although Brother Liu and I are friends, it's not good to say much at this time. Let's see how things develop. Sometimes it was because they were friends that they couldn't say much. Now, if Chu Xiu rushed over to Lu Fengxian and said that this woman definitely had ulterior motives, then they probably wouldn't even be friends anymore. At this moment, there were more and more people gathering at the foot of the mountain. If this dragged on, there might be more people coming. Han Tingyi from the Forgetful Sword Hut was the first to speak. Everyone, let's not delay anymore. No one knows if the Azure Water Sword sect has any treasures or inheritances. If this drags on, even if there are any treasures, there won't be enough for the future generations to share. Everyone present nodded. A monk fetching water to eat. If there were more monks, there wouldn't be any water to eat. After everyone present reached a consensus, they directly knocked on the Azure Water Sword sect's mountain gate. There were currently over 100 disciples standing guard within the Azure Water Sword sect. When the others saw so many people from the major sects ascending the mountain and looking at them covetously, they were all scared off. These 100 disciples could be said to be the disciples who were truly loyal to the Azure Watersword sect. They were still guarding the sect. With so many martial Dao masters present, one of them who was only in his 20s and had the strength of the Xiantian realm stood out with a resolute expression. I know that all of you are coveting the treasures of my Azure Watersword sect's ancestral grounds. With my strength, I am just like an ant in front of all the martial Dao masters. But I dare not forget the kindness of teaching, and cannot abandon the sect. If you want to seize my Azure Watersword sect's treasures, then you have to step over my dead body first. The major sects had their own heritage. To be able to be ranked among the top sects in the pugilistic world didn't only depend on the strength of the sect master, but also the heritage and spirit of the major sections. Just like the Azure Watersword sect in front of them, Lu Gongyuan, Shenbai, Doguangchen, and the other upper echelons of the Azure Watersword sect were all dead. The entire Azure Watersword sect was eliminated from the pugilistic world, and the Azure Watersword sect only existed in name. But even so, these disciples were still willing to guard the Azure Watersword sect until the very last moment. This was the heritage of the major sections. Everyone present frowned and felt that this was a little troublesome. This disciple was right. In front of these martial Dao masters from the major sects, they were indeed no different from ants, and could easily crush them to death. But killing and seizing treasures wasn't a nice thing to say. After all, they were all righteous sects, and yet they did such a thing. No matter how one looked at it, it would still affect the reputation of the sect. They originally thought that once they arrived, these Azure Watersword sect disciples would definitely be panic-stricken and open the door to welcome them, or they would immediately disperse. They didn't expect that there would be people among them who were so stubborn. Seeing this scene, Chu Xiu laughed and said, "You want to be a whore and also build a chastity. You all want the treasures, yet you are afraid of dirtying your own hands. Aren't you hypocritical?" Han Tingyi and the others all glared at Chu Xiu. Hidden Sword Villa's Cheng Tingfeng angrily said, "Chu Xiu, you are an evil Dao cultivator and you have the nerve to say such words?" When the Eastern Qi Alliance attacked Guanzhong, Cheng Tingfeng's elder brother, who was also the Hidden Sword Villa's villa master, Cheng Tingshan, was severely injured by Chu Xiu. The enmity between the two parties wasn't small. Chu Xiu said indifferently, "Why should I be embarrassed? If I want to snatch something, I will snatch it openly. Unlike you guys who are so hesitant and pretentious." Cheng Tingfeng still wanted to say something, but he was stopped by Han Tingyi. Now that Chu Xiu was willing to step forward and be the bad guy, they were happy to see it happen. Anyway, Chu Xiu's name in the pugilistic world was already notorious enough. It wasn't a big deal to be even more notorious. At this moment, seeing Chu Xiu step forward, the Azure Watersword sect's disciples all revealed a complicated hatred in their eyes. Chu Xiu had a feud with their Azure Watersword sect since a long time ago, including the current annihilation of the Azure Watersword sect. A part of it was caused by Chu Xiu. Of course, some people also thought that if Shenbai didn't have a feud with Chu Xiu, then even if Shenbai couldn't master the sect origin swords, Dou Guangchen and the others wouldn't have to die. Lu Gongyuan wouldn't have died so early. With Shenbai's talent, it was only a matter of time before he broke through to the martial Dao master. Azure Watersword sect wouldn't be as miserable as it was now. However, there were no ifs. The current state of the Azure Watersword sect was inseparable from Chu Xiu. Furthermore, Chu Xiu's infamy had long spread throughout the pugilistic world. Others might be concerned about their reputation, but Chu Xiu didn't care. He would really kill someone. So after seeing Chu Xiu step forward, even the originally firm disciples couldn't help but tremble at this moment. Looking at everyone present, Chu Xiu spoke indifferently. "Do all of you want to be buried with the Azure Watersword sect? I don't think so. Most of you are probably being coerced. Being afraid of death isn't something shameful. You only have one life. The Azure Watersword sect is already gone. What's the point of you dying for it? Now I will give you a chance." As he spoke, Chu Xiu waved his hand and circulated his astral qi. The soil and stones on the ground actually formed into the shape of a small house. Enter it one by one and tell me everything you know. If you tell me, you won't die. But take note, my patience is limited. There are more than 100 of you, but I only wish to spare 50 of you. As for the rest, even if you want to say it, you won't have the chance." As he spoke, Chushio directly pointed out a person. He swept his astral chi and threw him into the small house. With the astral chi wrapping around him, no one knew what he said. Only Chushio could hear it. After a moment, the person was thrown out and Chushio threw the second person in. As more and more people entered, the remaining Azure Water Sword sect disciples were already sweating profusely and were extremely anxious. They didn't even know if the person who entered would be stubborn to the end, or if he would spill everything he knew. They also didn't know if there would be any survivors when it was their turn. Humans had a tendency to blindly follow. Everyone wasn't afraid of death. With this courage, even if they were afraid of death, they wouldn't say it out loud. But once they were separated into individuals, that suspicion would appear in everyone's heart. Chapter 695. Chushio's move was very effective, at least to those unyielding Azure Billow Sword sect disciples. As the number of people decreased, the remaining people immediately broke down. Some of the disciples even cried out and took the initiative to rush forward. "I will speak. I know all the secrets of the Azure Billow Sword sect." Chushio casually waved his hand. "All right, I know what I need to know. I don't need anyone to lead the way. Those who stay here, bear the consequences." As Chushio's voice faded, all the Azure Billow Sword sect martial artists fled, leaving only the first martial artist who stood out. Everyone looked at each other. Chushio's move was indeed vicious. No one was truly unafraid of death. He had thoroughly understood the human heart, and toyed with it to the extreme. Chushio looked at the only martial artist who didn't leave and spoke indifferently. "Why aren't you leaving? Are you really not afraid of death?" That young martial artist laughed bitterly. "Afraid, extremely afraid. But the news of the Azure Billow Sword sect's ancestral ground having a secret treasure was leaked by me. I also didn't expect that this half-true half-false rumor would actually attract so many people to spy on me. I have let down the ancestor. How can I still have the face to escape?" As his voice faded, that young martial artist actually slammed his palm towards his own heart meridian, committing suicide on the spot. His actions could be considered as atonement. Originally, the Azure Billow Sword sect could still leave behind a trace of inheritance. But with his actions, the Azure Billow Sword sect's lineage would be completely annihilated. In fact, among the people present, no matter if it was those from the large sects who cared about their reputation or the vicious and merciless Chushio, as long as these disciples didn't obstruct them and obediently cooperated, they wouldn't kill the innocent. But the news of the Azure Billow Sword sect having a secret treasure had already spread out. At the foot of the mountain, there was still a dense crowd of rogue martial artists waiting to take advantage of the situation. Sooner or later, this news would spread throughout the entire pugilistic world. When the time comes, some of the martial artists in the pugilistic world would think that the Azure Water Sword sect's disciples had a peerless cultivation technique on them. They would definitely use all means to capture them and force out the secret technique. Even though they didn't know if it was true or false, but to the majority of the martial artist factions, it was a wise decision to kill the wrong person instead of letting them go. It was imaginable what kind of miserable state the Azure Water Sword sect would be facing. It was even possible that not a single disciple would be left alive. With no one blocking his path, Chushio headed straight for the back mountains of the Azure Water Sword sect. Just now, some of those disciples were stubborn and didn't say anything, but some of them really told Chushio in detail. Even though no one knew about the situation in the Azure Water Sword sect's back mountain, but these disciples had heard of some true and false gossips after so many years. Chushio more or less understood what was going on. Who would have thought that the Azure Water Sword sect's story that seemed like a myth and legend was actually true? But after so many years, there were countless martial artists that entered the Azure Water Sword sect's back mountain for seclusion. Among them were the most outstanding sect leader and disciples of the Azure Water Sword sect. But in the end, only Shunbai was able to successfully cultivate that cultivation technique. It was imaginable how harsh the conditions were. When the others saw Chuxio's actions, they all followed suit. Just now, only Chuxio was able to force out some information. It was definitely not wrong for them to follow Chuxio. The Azure Water Sword sect's back mountain's ancestral ground wasn't huge. According to the disciples, there should be a secret passage in this place. But only the sect leader knew the method to open the secret passage. Now that Lu Gongxian and Shenbai were dead, naturally no one knew the method to open the secret passage. Of course, for a martial artist of Chuxio's level, since there was no method to open it, then he would forcefully open it. Chuxio took a heavy step forward, and a powerful aura qi instantly seeped into the ground, causing the entire back mountain to tremble. Feeling this power, everyone present had a change in expression. These martial Dao masters present, whether it was Han Tingyi, Cheng Tingfeng, or the martial Dao master of Wind Cloud Sword Tomb, they were all shocked to find that in terms of strength, Chuxio, this junior, had completely surpassed them. Among them, the longest had been in the martial Dao master realm for 20 to 30 years, but in terms of strength, they were still inferior to Chuxio. Of course, they wouldn't think that they were inferior to Chuxio because of this. For a martial artist, strength was only a part of one's strength. This group of Sword Dao experts played with techniques. With strong attainments in Sword Dao, they could even use a portion of their strength to display 100% of their strength. Therefore, whether it was these older generation Sword Dao experts or Fang Qi Shao, they didn't focus on their own strength, but on the comprehension of Sword Dao. At this moment, under Chuxio's continuous steps, the ground cracked, and the secret passage that was covered with mechanisms and arrays appeared in front of everyone. Chuxio used the Heaven Demon Dance and directly slashed it open. Azure Billow Sword sect's secret passage wasn't left by that expert in the past, but it was built by the Azure Billow Sword sect's late ancestors. The arrays in it weren't that powerful, and it couldn't even withstand a few slashes from Chuxio. The secret passage shattered, and Chuxio entered directly without hesitation. Since this place was built by the Azure Billow Sword sect's later generations, it meant that there shouldn't be any danger. From the Azure Billow Sword sect's martial artists, Chuxio found out that there were some Azure Billow Sword sect's disciples who mistakenly entered this place, but nothing happened, so it should be safe. Chuxio didn't need others to scout the way, and he directly seized the initiative. Seeing Chuxio's actions, the others weren't willing to fall behind and fought to enter the tunnel. Below the tunnel was an extremely deep cave, and when Chuxio entered, the first thing he saw was an extremely conspicuous white skeleton. The white skeleton was as white as jade, and even though it was only a white skeleton, it was still emitting an astonishing sword intent. For this white skeleton, the sword intent was already immersed in his bones. Even if there was only a skeleton left, it still had a soaring sword intent. At this moment, Han Tingyi and the others also entered the cave, and the moment they saw the white skeleton, they received a shock that was even greater than Chuxio. After all, they were all swordsmen, and they naturally knew how difficult it was to cultivate to this step. This white skeleton must have been a heaven-defying Sword Dao master when it was alive. But just as they were in a daze, Chuxio had already made his move. Chuxio didn't take a closer look at the cultivation technique engraved under the surrounding walls, but it should be the cultivation technique that Shenbai obtained in the past. Even though Shenbai obtained a sword art, and for Chuxio, apart from understanding it by analogy, it wasn't of any direct use. But this was still a top-notch Sword Dao secret technique, and as long as he obtained it, it would be a gain. As the long saber in Chuxio's hand slashed down, a large piece of the wall was instantly chopped off, and even the cultivation technique words on it were kept by Chuxio into the cyst. Seeing Chuxio's action, the others immediately cursed. Everyone knew that Chuxio was proficient in saber arts, fists, palms, and many other cultivation techniques, but among the things that he was proficient in, there was no sword art. A saber user came to compete with a group of swordsmen for the Sword Dao secret technique. This behavior of Chuxio was purely harming others without benefiting himself. But cursing was just cursing. After seeing Chuxio's action, they also hurriedly made a move and began to cut off the cultivation technique on the wall. It didn't matter if they could gather it or not, they had to snatch a portion first. At most, they could just exchange it with others in the future. Even though this underground cave wasn't small, it wasn't big either. It simply couldn't withstand the power of so many martial Dao masters fighting at the same time. Everyone was afraid of directly blasting this underground cave into pieces, and no one would benefit, so they restrained their power. At this moment, Chu Xiu's heart suddenly moved, and he suddenly thought of something. Everyone thought that the most precious thing in this underground cave should be the cultivation technique on the wall. But for so many years, so many people in Azure Billow Sword sect had seen and cultivated this cultivation technique, but they all failed. Only Shenbai succeeded, and it was imaginable how difficult it was to cultivate this cultivation technique. According to the clues that the Azure Billow Sword sect's disciples said, even if the expert had become a skeleton, but still had sword chi soaring into the sky, he was the existence that created the Azure Billow Sword sect. He casually left behind something, and it created one of the 7 sects and 8 schools, the Azure Billow Sword sect. Even if such a person was really dead, he couldn't be treated as an ordinary corpse. Just like the glazed golden silk goo in Chu Xiu's body, it was refined from the Buddha bones of a Buddhist monk. Therefore, Chu Xiu moved and went straight for the white bones that were emitting sword chi. Everyone present was stunned, and soon after, someone reacted and wanted to stop him, but it was already too late. But just as Chu Xiu was standing in front of the white bones and was about to put it into the secret space box, his astral chi had just touched the white bones, and in an instant, the white sword chi devoured everything, enveloping everyone in the underground cave. When Chu Xiu opened his eyes again, he was already in another world. Surrounding him was a cliff that was overgrown with weeds. Chu Xiu walked to the top of the cliff and looked down. At the bottom of the cliff, there were still a few disciples of the sword hut looking around in a daze. Chu Xiu raised his eyebrows. It seemed that everyone in the cave was swept here. But what was this place? Was it another world? Or was it an independent space? This place should have never been discovered by the Azure Billow Sword sect's disciples, but thinking about it, it was normal. According to the Azure Billow Sword sect's disciples, the entire Azure Billow Sword sect was created from the inheritance left behind by this expert. It could be said that his status was even higher than the founder of the Azure Billow Sword sect. Generations of Azure Billow Sword sect martial artists entered the underground cave for life and death seclusion, and they were all extremely respectful to him, not daring to offend him in the slightest. How could they be like Chu Xiu and still want to put him into the secret space box, which was why they never touched the white bones? Thinking of the Azure Billow Sword sect, Chu Xiu suddenly thought of something. He suddenly leaped onto a large tree at the highest point of the cliff, and sized up his surroundings. He knew exactly where he was. He was still in the Azure Billow Sword sect, but not the current Azure Billow Sword sect, but the Azure Billow Sword sect from 10,000 years ago, before it was split apart by a sword and formed into the Azure Billow River. Chapter 696. Traveling through time was very mystical. Could that expert's strength be so formidable to such an extent that the method he left behind could allow someone to travel through 10,000 years? Chu Xiu didn't believe it, but everything around him was extremely real. Even Chu Xiu's own strength wasn't suppressed much. The Azure Billow Sword sect 10,000 years ago was much larger than the current Azure Billow Sword sect. It was a giant mountain that was surrounded by cliffs and jagged rocks. Chu Xiu couldn't find any traces of others, let alone traces of that ancient expert. However, Chu Xiu believed that since the other party had left behind such a contingency plan and brought them all here, there must be a deeper meaning behind it. Therefore, Chu Xiu wasn't flustered and was just exploring the mountain leisurely. Along the way, he encountered a few disciples from other sword sects, but when they saw Chu Xiu, they would immediately flee. Chu Xiu was considered to be infamous now. These ordinary disciples were truly fearful when they saw Chu Xiu. But even if they didn't flee, it was fine. Chu Xiu wasn't so bored that he would kill anyone he saw. Right now, on the other side of the cliff, Yan Fian was leading a female disciple to repel a few Hidden Sword Villa disciples. The Yunu Palace and the Hidden Sword Villa had always had some grudges. Even if they didn't find any treasures, both parties still fought because of the verbal conflict. After defeating the disciples of the Hidden Sword Villa alone, Yan Fian sighed as he held his sword. Back when the Yu Palace was at its peak, the Hidden Sword Villa definitely wouldn't dare to be so arrogant. Senior sister, are you all right? When the female disciple behind Yan Fian saw that Yan Fian seemed to be distracted, she couldn't help but worry. The palace mistress was severely injured, and everything in the Yu Palace was relying on Yan Fian. Standing on the cliff, Yan Fian used her hand to comb her messy hair and shook her head. I'm fine. Wonder, you don't have to worry. The female disciple who spoke was the female disciple Chu Xiu had a conflict with when he first met the Yu Palace. At that time, Wan'er's attitude was arrogant and willful. Now that several years had passed and the Yu Palace was gradually declining, Wan'er seemed to have matured a lot. Her expression was no longer that arrogant and willful. Looking at Yan Fian, Wan'er seemed to want to say something, but she held it back. Seeing Wan'er's appearance, Wan'er couldn't help but frown. Wan'er, what do you want to say? Don't be so hesitant. After a moment of silence, Wan'er said, Master Lu is a good man. Yan Fian's expression changed, and he said in a low voice, Of course I know he is a good person. No one who is acquainted with LV Fengxian would say anything bad about him. Wan'er hesitated for a moment and said, So senior sister, isn't it a bit too much to plot against young Master Liu? If you let young Master Lu handle that matter, once something goes wrong, young Master Lu will. Yan Fian turned around and looked at Wan. In a deep voice he said, I know these things even without you telling me. But now Master is heavily injured. Even with Feng Buping's treatment, the problems that have arisen from her cultivation cannot be healed in a short time. If Master can't handle it, I can't handle it either. Do you want to see the Yu Palace be destroyed? But senior sister, you can ask Ying Bailu for help. The Ying clan of Shangshui only needs to use 1/10 of its strength to help the Yu Palace get through this crisis. Yan Fian smiled bitterly and rubbed Wan'er's head. Don't be silly. Aristocratic families and top sects won't be controlled by one person. For example, Chu Xiu and Feng Qishao are best friends, but Feng Qishao was still forced to fight Chu Xiu by Sorking City. Ying Bailu will agree to help me, but the Ying clan of Shangshui won't. If something goes wrong, the Yu Palace will offend the Ying clan of Shangshui. As the head of the 9 great aristocratic families, the terror of the Ying clan of Shangshui is beyond your imagination. Wan'er wanted to say something but was interrupted by Yan Fian. Enough, Wan'er. I know what I'm doing. I've let Lu Fengxian down. But I can't ignore the Yu Palace. I owe Lu Fengxian. After the Yu Palace gets through this and regains its glory, I'll use my entire life to repay him. But now, I can only say sorry to him. With that, Yan Fian left with Wan'er. But Wan'er still had a worried look on her face as she followed behind Yan Fian. Her senior apprentice sister used to be rational, but she'd been under too much pressure recently, and had become paranoid. As for the paranoid Wan'er, she'd become more mature because of age or the tempering of the Jianghu. Young Master Lu was a good person. The price of scheming against a good person was obviously lower than scheming against an existence that couldn't be provoked. But her senior apprentice sister had forgotten one thing. Although young Master Lu was indeed a loner compared to Ying Bailu, none of his friends were easy to deal with. Shangyang Mo clan's heir Mo Tianlin, Heaven Alliance's Chunqingdi's disciple Xie Shaolu, Sorking City's heir Feng Qishao, second on the Longhu leaderboard. But these were all secondary. The most terrifying thing was that many people in the Jianghu knew that Chu Xiu and Lu Fengxian had been good friends for many years. Compared to others, they might have to have various forces behind them as a foil, but Chu Xiu didn't. Even without the label of the Hidden Devil Clan, Chu Xiu was terrifying enough. Wan'er had interacted with Chu Xiu before. When she was young and ignorant, she'd even had a conflict with Chu Xiu, which had left a deep shadow in her heart. If her senior apprentice sister schemed against young Master Lu and really angered Chu Xiu, wouldn't the consequences be better than provoking the Shangshui Ying clan? Wan'er didn't know this. She wanted to advise Yan Fian, but unfortunately, Yan Fian wouldn't listen to other people's advice. At this moment, Chu Xiu was heading in the direction of Kanglin River according to his memory. It was said that Kanglin River was formed by a sword slash from that expert in the past. Maybe there would be some clues there? However, before he could reach the place, a thunderous explosion resounded in the air. The clouds and mist in the air dissipated, revealing two figures standing within. One of the figures was wearing a blue coarse hemp robe, but his body was straight, and his whole body was filled with a shocking sword essence. As for the other person, he was wearing a blood-red battle armor. His arms were exposed, and there were strange blood-red patterns on the armor. Even his arms were tattooed with those strange patterns, emitting a scorching and violent aura. Without exception, the appearance of these two people couldn't be seen clearly. Their faces seemed to be covered by a thin layer of gauze, and it was impossible to see them clearly. The one in blue should be the sword principal expert from the past, but Chushio felt that the warrior in the battle armor was somewhat familiar. He wasn't familiar with this person, but he was familiar with the aura on him. At this moment, the sword principal expert shook his head and said, "You guys can be good people, but you insist on being watchdogs. How sad is that?" The figure in the battle armor said angrily, "Watchdogs? Do you want to die for insulting the heavenly gates?" Hearing that, Chushio's eyes were instantly filled with terror. The figure in the battle armor was a divine general of the heavenly gates, or the master of the heavenly gates. No wonder Chushio felt that the aura on him was somewhat familiar. Chushio also felt a similar aura on Divine Lord Luo. The sword principal expert actually called the heavenly gates watchdogs, which surprised Chushio. This wasn't a good thing to say. What kind of existence could make the supreme expert of the heavenly gates watchdogs? The sword principal expert said indifferently, "Since you've done it, why don't you let people talk about it? We practice martial arts and cultivate our bodies, and the power we obtain is upright. It's despicable to rely on being watchdogs and groveling to obtain power. The heavenly gates treats others like ants, but you guys are the real ants. You're courting death." The expert from the heavenly gate furiously roared. As his fist descended, the blood-colored patterns on his armor blossomed with a glaring red light. As if they were alive, they densely wrapped around his fist. In an instant, the void collapsed. This fist truly had the power to shatter mountains and rivers. As for the sword principal expert, he was surrounded by a dense amount of sword chi. Each sword chi contained an astonishing sword intent. As he stabbed out with his finger, the sword intent instantly condensed into a huge long sword, slashing across the sky. After breaking the gate of heaven expert's punch, it directly cut the entire Mount Azure billow into two. In an instant, the ground cracked, as if an earth dragon was flipping over, and a huge crack appeared on the ground. Previously, it was said that the Tsonglan River was slashed by a sword principal expert. Now Chushio finally knew that, to be precise, the Tsonglan River was slashed by the aftermath of the sword principal expert's sword. As far as Chushio was concerned, no matter if it was the expert in the sword Dao or the expert in the heaven entrance, their strengths had absolutely surpassed the true fire spirit refinement realm, and it was even to the extent that they'd attained the legendary profound attainment realm. Chushio had seen many true fire spirit refinement realm experts, such as the sword principal expert and the heavenly gates expert in the Battle of Mount Fuyu. The experts of the 5 major sword sects, Donghuang Tai and Wei Shiya, and Divine Lord Luo from the heavenly gates. These people were strong, but they definitely couldn't cause such a level of lethality. At that moment, the battle between the two people in midair was so intense that it had even surpassed the level of martial arts. It was as if they had transcended the mortal realm and entered the realm of divinity. They were so strong that even if Chushio raised his heaven's sun gazing at air to the extreme, he still couldn't understand it. However, the only thing Chushio could understand was that the sword principal expert should have had the upper hand. But why was he the one who died in the end? At that moment, the heavenly gates expert was suppressed to the extreme. He roared and took out a box from his arms. He suddenly opened it. An ray of light bloomed, smashing the sword chi and blasting into the sword principal expert's body, causing him to spit out a mouthful of blood and directly fall from midair. The blood that the sword principal expert spat out turned into a small sword, as if it had pierced through space, and in the next moment, it actually pierced through the sky gates expert. Chapter 697. That expert from the way of the sword and the expert from the gate of heaven perished together. However, in the end, the expert from the way of the sword fell on the azure billow mountain. As for the expert from the gate of heaven, after his body was pierced, he staggered and flew into the distance. His whereabouts were unknown, and no one knew whether he was dead or alive. Chushio was stunned. Things ended just like that? Did the two of them just inexplicably perish together like this? No, it should be one was dead while the other's status was unknown. Just at this moment, a vigorous voice came from midair. My sword intent inheritance, do not help me take revenge. There is only one thing you need to remember: destroy the heaven's gate to ensure the eternal existence of the mortal world. Chushio frowned. Why did this sword Dao elite speak so incoherently? At the start, he said there was no need to help him take revenge, but at the end he said he wanted to destroy the heaven's gate? This was even more difficult. This was something that even Dugu Weiwei couldn't do. And what was descend to the mortal world? He seemed to remember that when he entered the minor mortal hidden domain, he asked Shui Wuxiang about these things. Back then, Shui Wuxiang said that during the ancient times, there was a stone tablet erected on the peak of the highest mountain in the west, empty azure heaven. On it were the words Upper Mortal World. After the mortal world boundary monument shattered, it became the key to the minor mortal world. Chushio still had quite a few of them. Why was there another descend to the mortal world now? Chushio didn't really understand these ancient secrets, but the only thing he knew was that this expert had left his true inheritance of sword intent here. Speaking of which, the Azure Water Sword sect was really stupid. They could be said to have missed out on the most precious thing. Was the inheritance left behind by this sword Dao elite really the cultivation technique? In fact, it wasn't. Even though the cultivation technique was important, the more important thing was the person who cultivated the cultivation technique, and the sword intent that he comprehended. After so many generations of the Azure Water Sword sect, none of them were able to comprehend the sect origin swords. Only Shenbai managed to cultivate it by chance. In fact, it wasn't because the cultivation technique was too difficult, but because they hadn't even found the path to entry. If they were to stubbornly cultivate it, the success rate would be extremely low. Just like Chen Qingdi's fist intent, if he directly threw the fist technique to Xie Xiaolu, with Xie Xiaolu's aptitude, he would probably only be able to learn the basics in his lifetime. However, if he taught Xie Xiaolu by example, then he could guarantee that Xie Xiaolu would be able to receive his inheritance. Now this sword principal powerhouse's inheritance was the same. It could be said that this was an existence that was even more precious than the sword techniques he had left behind. At the thought of this, Chushio immediately sped towards the place where the sword principal powerhouse had fallen. When he arrived, Chushio discovered that there were no corpses. There were only 3 swords floating in the air, emitting a transparent glow. One of the swords was as black as ink and emitted death intent. The other was bright blue and emitted the power of vitality. The middle sword was misty and it was impossible to tell what attribute it had. But before Chushio could make a move, someone else was faster than him. Han Tingyi, who had forgotten about the sword hut, appeared out of nowhere. With a swing of the sword in his hand, he turned into a sword light and arrived in front of the 3 swords in an instant. Chushio's primordial spirit condensed into an arrow and shot out the god-exterminating arrow. The speed of the arrow was incomparably fast. With a silent whistle, it arrived behind Han Tingyi in an instant, forcing Han Tingyi to turn around to defend against this sword. A dazzling sword light lingered and a cold sword intent burst out. Han Tingyi actually used the power of sword intent to forcefully shatter the soul-exterminating arrow. After making a move, Chushio suddenly frowned. That strike just now gave him a feeling that it was both real and unreal. It was as though when he shot the arrow, it wasn't a normal strike. It was as though he was recalling his past strikes and didn't even consume any spiritual energy. He seemed to have understood something. He had not traveled through time and arrived 10,000 years ago. Instead, it was the elite swordsmen who had pulled their spirits into a world, a spiritual world that he had constructed himself. When making a move here, the power that Chushio and the others used was all from their memories. To put it simply, how strong they were in their memories was how strong they were in this spiritual world. Here, even if they used cultivation techniques like blood ignition, it wouldn't hurt their physical body. If this spiritual world could be casually entered, then it would be a great place to practice martial skills. It was unknown if Han Tingyi noticed that something was wrong with this place. He just glared at Chu Xiu and said, "Chu Xiu, you are a saber user. Why are you here? Why were there so many sword sects among the martial artists that came to Azure Water Sword Sect?" It was because they knew that the Azure Water Sword Sect's secret treasures were only related to the sword. What was the use of other martial artists that didn't practice the sword coming here? Only a weirdo like Chu Xiu, who obviously didn't use the sword, but still came here to join in the fun. Chu Xiu spoke indifferently, drawing parallels. Who said that a saber can't use a sword? Han Tingyi heard this and was infuriated. Chu Xiu was obviously harming others without benefiting himself, and he couldn't do anything about it. It was just a single exchange, but Han Tingyi already knew that he couldn't defeat Chu Xiu. At least he couldn't force Chu Xiu to retreat so easily. Right now the others were also rushing over. If they delayed any longer, it would be another chaotic battle. Therefore, Han Tingyi directly said, "Alright, if you want to draw parallels, there are 3 sword intent inheritances here. You can pick one first, and the other 2 belong to me." Chu Xiu shook his head and said, "This is not enough. My 2 friends also use the sword, so I want all 3 sword intents." Han Tingyi's face revealed an angry expression. Before he could say anything, the other 2 figures rushed towards the sword intents. These 2 were Cheng Tingshan and the martial artist from Storm Sword Tomb. The 3 of them were in a chaotic battle. Chu Xiu didn't make a move. If he made a move, he wouldn't be able to benefit from it. It would probably turn into a 4-man battle. The entire Azure Water Mountain was only so big. In just a short moment, Fang Qishao and the others had arrived. Seeing this scene, Fang Qishao couldn't help but shake his head and said, "This expert is too much. Isn't it just a sword intent inheritance? Why don't you give a few more? How can there be enough to distribute now?" As he said that, Fang Qishao poked Chu Xiu. "What should we do? Directly snatch it?" However, at this time, Fang Qishao realized that Chu Xiu didn't respond to him. He just stared at the battle between the 3 people. He couldn't help but feel a little puzzled. Was Chu Xiu afraid? It shouldn't be. With Chu Xiu's personality, not to mention the 3 martial Dao masters in front of him, even if it was a true fire spirit refinement powerhouse in front of him, as long as there were benefits, Chu Xiu would dare to plot against them. Just as Fang Qishao wanted to say something, Chu Xiu suddenly said, "Do you know where this is?" 7th young master Fang was taken aback. "Don't take me for an idiot. This is 10,000 years in the past. I don't know how that swordsman managed to send us 10,000 years in the past. Could it be that he cultivates a martial art that has something to do with time or space?" Hearing Fang Qishao's words, Chu Xiu finally understood what the problem was. When he saw the 3 people fighting earlier, Chu Xiu felt that something was wrong because the 3 of them didn't use their full strength. Chu Xiu had already seen through what was going on in this world. This was simply a spiritual world simulated by someone. Even if one burned their blood essence, it would not affect the outside world. Therefore, when they attacked, they didn't have to care so much at all. They just used their strongest moves. However, Han Tingyi and the other 2 always held back, as if they were fighting in the outside world. Now that Chu Xiu asked Fang Qishao, he finally understood that the essence of this world should have been discovered by him. Although the others didn't know what was going on with them, it was obvious that they must have thought that they were in a world. They didn't expect that their bodies and spirits had been separated. In fact, Chu Xiu was able to discover this purely by accident. If Chu Xiu had been using a normal cultivation technique, he definitely wouldn't have been able to discover this. This was because the spiritual world was too realistic. It was so realistic that the cultivation techniques they used came from his memories, from himself. It was only when Chu Xiu used the soul-destroying arrow that he felt that something was wrong. This was because he didn't feel the consumption of his spiritual power. This world was originally virtual, with their spiritual power as the core. This was the most essential thing. Therefore, this world could simulate the consumption of spiritual qi, but it couldn't simulate the changes of the spiritual power itself. Apart from Chu Xiu, No one else present was proficient in secret spiritual techniques. Perhaps after a period of time, they would also be able to think of this. However, at least for now, only Chu Xiu and the others could guess this. Looking at Feng Qishao and Lu Fengxian, Chu Xiu said in a low voice, "Do the two of you trust me?" Lu Fengxian was stunned for a moment, then nodded and said, "Of course I trust you." Feng Qishao chuckled and said, "I do, but it depends on what it is. For example, if you say that you're more handsome than me, I definitely won't believe you." Another example. Chu Xiu didn't continue to listen to Feng Qishao's example. He directly transmitted his voice and said, "If you trust me, then burn your blood essence later. Erupt with your strongest power, and attack with all your might. Snatch those 3 sword intents together. This world is a virtual spiritual world. Even if we burn our blood essence here, it won't affect the outside world." Chu Xiu's words were indeed a little shocking. Burning one's blood essence was something that could cause serious injuries if not handled properly. If you said that this was a virtual world, then it was a virtual world. If something went wrong, who would be responsible? Therefore, Chu Xiu asked them if they believed him. Only they believed that the 3 of them could force Han Tingyi and the others to retreat if they attacked together. If they hesitated, it would be ineffective. Feng Qishao was stunned and said, "Virtual? Interesting. You can play it like this?" Lu Fengxian nodded and said, "No problem. It's useless for me to get the sword intense inheritance, so I have to give my share to Fian." After all, it was Chu Xiu's idea. Although it was up to him to decide who to give the things to after getting them. Lu Fengxian also told Chu Xiu in advance to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings. After all, Chu Xiu and the Yunnu Palace still had some conflicts before. Chapter 698. Chu Xiu and the other 2 had joined forces to set up a trap without bringing Mo Tianlin. It was not that they were deliberately rejecting Mo Tianlin, but that Mo Tianlin's own strength was too low. Rashly making a move would instead appear fake. Although Mo Tianlin also had the strength of unity of heaven and man, his unity of heaven and man was still a long way off compared to Feng Qishao and Lu Fengxian. Chu Xiu, on the other hand, secretly glanced at Lu Fengxian and shook his head slightly. Lu Fengxian was now doing everything for Yan Fian's sake. Obviously, he was already deeply in love with her. In fact, Lu Fengxian was such a person. If he used you as a shield for his friends, he would be willing to risk his life for you. And now, since he regarded Yan Fian as his lover, it was naturally even more normal for him to do all this. Unfortunately, sometimes not everyone would accept your kindness and love, and then return it. Most people would take it for granted. Chu Xiu, Lu Fengxian, and Feng Qishao looked at each other and immediately made a move. In an instant, the qi and blood around the 3 of them soared to the sky. They actually chose to directly burn their blood essence. Chu Xiu had already stepped into the martial Dao Grandmaster realm. The strength of Feng Qishao and Lu Fengxian was also not inferior to that of a martial Dao Grandmaster. The power of these 3 people burning their qi and blood was simply terrifying. Feeling the power of Chu Xiu and the other 2, the expressions of Han Tingyi and the other 2 suddenly changed. Was this Chu Xiu crazy? He actually chose to burn his blood essence at this time, just for a sword intent inheritance. Was it worth it? Moreover, he himself did not use a sword. And Feng Qishao and Lu Fengxian were the same. Were young people nowadays so desperate? Or were these old fellows really a little afraid of death? Within the spiritual world, Chu Xiu did not need to worry about any exhaustion. Hence, when he attacked, he did not directly use any other martial techniques. Instead, he wanted to test out the martial technique that he was unable to control, the strongest saber move belonging to Dugu Weiwa, the ethereal mortal slash. In fact, Chu Xiu did not know whether this move was used or not. In the past, when he was facing Divine Lord Luo, Chu Xiu used this move. However, at that time, Chu Xiu was in a state of chaos, and he did not really use this move. It was just a stance. In this fictional spiritual world, Chu Xiu did not have to worry about anything. He did not have to worry about anything. He could boldly use the red dust slash. Chu Xiu raised his saber and released a profound aura. Everything in front of him started to freeze. The entire space became like a mirror, appearing before Chu Xiu. There was a look of surprise in Han Tingyi's eyes because Chu Xiu's target was him. Among the three, Cheng Tingfeng's strength was not too strong. Chu Xiu did not know much about the martial artist from Windcloud Sword Tomb. But he should not be one of the famous martial arts masters in Windcloud Sword Tomb. Therefore, Han Tingyi should be the strongest among them. Of course, Chu Xiu chose him as the first target. Under the misty red dust slash, Han Tingyi felt as if his entire body had been imprisoned in this space. No matter how he struggled, he was unable to break free. At this time, Han Tingyi was almost going crazy. As a veteran martial arts master, he could certainly feel the power of Chu Xiu's saber. But it was precisely because of this that he did not understand. Chu Xiu burned all the essence and blood in his body to slash this powerful saber. It was as if he was risking his life. No, it should be said that he was risking his life. However, he did not seem to have a deep grudge with Chu Xiu. He was just fighting with him for the sword intent inheritance. This was a very normal thing. Why did Chu Xiu have to be so angry and fight with him? Chu Xiu wanted to fight with his life, but he did not want to die with Chu Xiu here. Therefore, at this moment, Han Tingyi's body shone with a dazzling white light. The martial artists of the sword hut practiced sword techniques, understood the theory of the sword, and understood sword intent. They cultivated the way of the sword, so their foundation was extremely solid. Han Tingyi had already comprehended sword intent, and raised it to the extreme, forging his own indestructible sword soul. His entire body's essence, qi, spirit, and blood had become one. Han Tingyi's eyes were already lifeless, but the long sword in his hand was still shining brightly. As the sword slashed down, the power of the misty red dust slash that seemed to be imprisoning the void began to loosen. But at this moment, Chu Xiu's saber also fell at the same time. Like a mirror, Chu Xiu slashed on the outside, and Han Tingyi slashed on the inside. There was a silent loud sound, and the space was torn apart. Everything was like a mirror, shattering. Han Tingyi's eyes regained their color. At the same time, he looked at his body with a look of horror in his eyes. The sword soul was a powerful sword technique that he was still unable to master. It was even possible that his martial arts would be crippled if he made a mistake. Moreover, even if he did not cripple his martial arts, he would definitely suffer a backlash. But now he had clashed head-on with Chu Xiu, and he was not injured at all. What was going on? At this moment, Han Tingyi also saw that Chu Xiu's blood was burning fiercely, but he was still heading toward the sword intent inheritance. His expression suddenly changed. Han Tingyi was not an idiot. After seeing this scene, he immediately realized what was going on. However, it was too late. He could only watch as Chu Xiu took the black sword intent inheritance in his hand. With a flash of light, the sword intent inheritance instantly integrated into Chu Xiu's body. And it was not only Chu Xiu, but also Lu Fengxian and Fang Qishao. Fang Qishao's strength was already comparable to some martial arts masters. His opponent was Cheng Tingfeng. Under the Karma Sword principle, he obtained the Misty Sword intent inheritance when Cheng Tingfeng subconsciously retreated. As for LV Fengxian, she directly took out her unparalleled divine weapon. Although it was such a simple halberd strike, the might it exuded was enough to shake the heavens and earth. It was extremely terrifying, directly forcing that expert from the Windcloud Sword Tomb to retreat. He also managed to obtain the inheritance of the unparalleled divine weapon. Originally, the inheritance of sword intent should have been able to directly enter their minds. However, LV Fengxian waved his hand and directly sent his inheritance of sword intent into Yanfian's body. This caused Yanfian's expression to instantly become somewhat complicated. Seeing that Lu Fengxian and Fang Qishao had clearly burned their blood essence, but now nothing happened to them, everyone present had already realized that something was wrong. Han Tingyi's group looked at Chu Xiu's group with an incomparably gloomy gaze. They had miscalculated. The three of them were all veterans, and the youngest among them had already stepped into the martial arts master realm for more than a decade. In the end, they were actually schemed against by three juniors. How embarrassing! Right at this moment, there was a sudden long sigh in midair. Everything in front of them was like a mirror that immediately shattered. When everyone opened their eyes again, They were still in the Azure Water Sword Sect's underground cave. Even their positions didn't change at all. The only change was that the sword chi that was originally soaring into the sky, and the white jade-like skeleton was now grayish-white and dilapidated. As the airflow in the underground cave swept across, it actually turned into dust. In all fairness, this sword principal powerhouse was really a kind person. There were often some ancient experts who left behind inheritances, but at the same time, they would also leave behind all sorts of tests to test if one was qualified to inherit their inheritance. Moreover, most of these tests were incomparably dangerous. If one wasn't careful, they would even lose their life there. And this Sword Dao expert was simply a clean stream among the ancient experts. He didn't even leave behind the slightest test. He just played the scene back then, and told the descendants to help him take revenge. Then he threw out the inheritance without any restrictions. Even if one got the inheritance but didn't want to help him take revenge, there was no loss at all. Whether it was now or in the past, there were very few such honest people. It was a pity that the forgetful Sword Hut and the other forces only obtained some remnant 10,000 swords returned to origin. They didn't even get a single one of the most valuable sword intent inheritance. Looking at Chu Xiu's group, Han Tingyi and the others surrounded them with gloomy expressions. Chu Xiu sneered. Why? Just now was just an act, and now you want to do it for real? All right then, we will accompany you to the end. Han Tingyi's group glanced at each other, and ultimately didn't make a move. They didn't even leave any harsh words, and immediately turned to leave. Of course, they weren't afraid, but it wasn't worth it to make a move now. The sword intent inheritance had already been absorbed into the body of Chu Xiu's group. Even if they killed Chu Xiu's group, they still wouldn't be able to obtain it. Most importantly, in that spiritual world, everything might be fabricated, but this fabricated reality was based on reality. Only Chu Xiu's group had that kind of strength, and they were able to exhibit this level of strength in the virtual world. During the battle just now, they had already seen it clearly. Even if it was in reality, if Chu Xiu's group used this life-risking method, they still wouldn't be able to withstand it. Therefore, there was no longer any meaning to continue fighting, let alone the fact that they couldn't win. If they continued to fight, both sides would still suffer. The Azure Water Sword Sect's mountain was still densely packed with martial artists, and they were still waiting for the results. In everyone's guesses, these major sword sects and Chu Xiu would definitely have a great battle. But in the end, they didn't seem to hear any commotion at the foot of the mountain. In less than 2 hours, the major sword sect's members had already left with dark expressions. What was going on? After a moment, Chu Xiu's group also left. After arriving at an uninhabited place, Chu Xiu's group then took out the 10,000 swords returned to origin fragment and exchanged it. Previously in the cave, they more or less obtained some 10,000 swords returned to origin fragment. Even though the few of them combined weren't able to gather the complete 10,000 swords returned to origin fragment, it was still an absolute sword arts fragment. It was still very useful to them, at least they could comprehend it by analogy. Just as they were exchanging the fragment, Chu Xiu walked towards the Yu Palace's group. Chapter 699. Because of the conflict between Chu Xiu and the Yu Palace in the past, his image in the eyes of the Yu Palace's people was definitely not good. Even because of his relationship with Lu Fengxian, the Yu Palace and Chu Xiu were no longer at loggerheads like before. But subconsciously, the disciples of the Yu Palace still had some fear and vigilance towards Chu Xiu. Walking in front of Yan Fian, Chu Xiu said indifferently, "Can I say a few words in private?" Yan Fian nodded, indicating for Wan and the other female disciples of the Yu Palace to leave. She said in a low voice, "What does official Chu want to ask?" Chu Xiu looked at the horizon and said in a low voice, "You know my relationship with Brother Lu. Although in the eyes of outsiders, Brother Lu hangs out with people of the demonic path like me and doesn't do those chivalrous things, he is actually a good person. He is a person who will return 10 times to you if you treat him well. Unfortunately, in this world, good people usually don't live long. If I didn't know Brother Lu, then I naturally wouldn't care about those things. But with my relationship with Brother Lu, there are some things that I can't ignore. Miss Yan, let me give you a word of advice. In the future, think before you act. The road of Jianghu is long, but the road of life is long. The ebb and flow of the tide is very normal. Don't lose yourself for the sake of the sect. Throughout history, it's not rare to find nothing after calculating all sorts of schemes in Jianghu. Yan Fian frowned and said, I don't quite understand what you're saying. Chu Xiu smiled and said, whether you understand or not, you know in your heart. Miss Yan, take care. After saying that, Chu Xiu directly turned and left, leaving Yan Fian looking at his back with a puzzled light in her eyes. By the time Chu Xiu returned, they had already sorted out the remnant 10,000 swords returned to the sect. They gave a copy to Chu Xiu and a copy to Mo Tianlin. Speaking of which, Mo Tianlin was the luckiest. He just came to be a bystander and obtained such a powerful remnant sword technique. Lu Fengxian looked at Chu Xiu in surprise and said, What did you say to Fian? Chu Xiu laughed and said, Nothing much, I'm an acquaintance. I heard that there were some problems in the Yu Palace, so I asked about them recently. Changing the topic, Chu Xiu suddenly said, Right, don't let Shui Wuxiang and the others leave you in the future. Of the Yu Palace, Shui Wuxiang and the others were truly loyal to LV Fengxian. Or, it could be said that they weren't loyal to LV Fengxian, but they were loyal to Marquis Wen's inheritance that LV Fengxian possessed. In any case, it didn't matter. Shui Wuxiang and the others were people from the ancient age. Although they had been sealed underground for 10,000 years, they had still lived for such a long time, so they still had some experience. Chu Xiu believed that regarding Yan Fian, Shui Wuxiang and the others should also be able to see that something was wrong, so they also went to warn her. However, with Lu Fengxian's personality, although he looked calm, as long as he made a decision, no one could change it. Therefore, Chu Xiu didn't need to ask to know what was going on. But by bringing Shui Wuxiang and the others with him, if anything happened, they could at least help a little. After chatting with everyone for a while, Chu Xiu directly left with his people, preparing to return to the northern Yan. On the way, Chu Xiu also studied the sword intent inheritance that he had obtained. There were a total of 3 sword intent inheritances, all of which represented the expert's understanding of the sword Dao, and there was no difference in superiority. Among them, the sword intent inheritance that Lu Fengxian had given to Yan Fian represented vitality, while the black sword intent inheritance that Chu Xiu had obtained represented slaughter and death. After all, the sword itself was a weapon, and as long as it was a weapon, it would need to be stained with a fierce and murderous aura in order to grow. The sword intent inheritance that Fang Qi had obtained was the most interesting. His sword intent inheritance did not have an attribute, but it represented the expert's understanding of the sword Dao source. It could be said that it was the most precious of the 3 sword intent inheritances. Chu Xiu raised his eyebrows. He took out the heavenly demon dance in his hand, and in an instant, a black force enveloped the entire heavenly demon dance. The black saber qi spread, dancing around Chu Xiu's body. Even among the martial artists that Chu Xiu had brought, there were saber wielders, and the sabers in their hands were constantly trembling, as if they were being triggered by the saber qi. Dispersing the power, Chu Xiu withdrew the heavenly demon dance, who said that saber wielders could not comprehend the sword intent inheritance. The path of martial Dao had always been different paths leading to the same destination. Chu Xiu knew too many martial Dao, which was why his martial Dao wasn't on the saber, nor on the sword, but on the pursuit of the extremity of martial Dao. After returning to the northern Yan, Chu Xiu asked Mei Qinglian about the situation. During this period of time, the northern Yan martial world could be said to be very peaceful, and there were no incidents. Mei Qinglian extended her hand. Did you get any benefits from the trip to the Azure Water Sword sect? Don't take it all for yourself. Chu Xiu threw the sect origin remnant scroll to her and said, I got the best thing, but it is a pity that it is an inheritance, and I can't give it to others. This is the remnant scroll of Shenbai's cultivation technique, and it is an extremely strong sword skill. Mei Qinglian took a few glances and threw it to the side. No matter how strong the sword skill was, it didn't interest her much. She wasn't Chu Xiu, and didn't have the energy to cultivate so many complicated cultivation techniques. Mei Qinglian only needed to cultivate the beauty technique to the extreme. As for other things, she didn't have the energy to cultivate the sword Dao. Chu Xiu hadn't completely digested the sword Dao inheritance that the sword Dao expert left behind. This thing had to be comprehended before he could modify it to suit his own martial Dao, which was why it was a waste of time. After arranging everything, Chu Xiu immediately went into seclusion again. Half a month later, before Chu Xiu came out, Zhao Qingping came looking for him, saying that he had something to report. Chu Xiu walked out of the seclusion room and asked, "What happened?" Zhao Qingping said in a deep voice, "It is Shen Changming from the Shen clan. He said he found a person, and it is related to you." Chu Xiu said in surprise, "Related to me? Who is it?" Zhao Qingping said, "It's a disciple from the mortuary manor in the past. He was talking about you outside, and was brought here by Shen Changming after he found out." Chu Xiu frowned. It was just such a small matter? Following Nie Renlong's death, the mortuary manor was already destroyed. Even though there were still quite a number of mortuary manor disciples wandering outside, Chu Xiu didn't care. Without Nie Renlong, the mortuary manor was just a plate of loose sand and didn't pose any threat. So if some mortuary manor disciples were to secretly scold him, it actually didn't matter. Shen Changming actually still brought the other party over. It was somewhat making a big fuss over a minor issue. Of course, Chu Xiu couldn't say anything. That would be too much of a blow to the other party's enthusiasm. Therefore, Chu Xiu had no choice but to say, "Bring the other party over." After a moment, Zhao Qingping brought Shen Changming over. After seeing Chu Xiu, Shen Changming immediately bowed and spoke with a slightly flattering tone. "Congratulations to my lord for showing off your prowess in Wei County and obtaining the treasure. Even the 5 major sword sects had to return in defeat under your hands." The incident regarding the Azure Water Sword sect had already spread throughout the pugilistic world. The Azure Water Sword sect had an important treasure, but the 5 major sword sects made a move at the same time. In the end, apart from Fang Qishao, who had a good relationship with Chu Xiu, and the Yunnu Palace, who had the help of Lu Fengxian, the others didn't even get a single bit of benefit. This was somewhat unexpected. Of course, everyone only discussed about this pugilistic world's gossip. After all, it wasn't considered a huge matter. But since Shen Changming was now Chu Xiu's subordinate, he naturally had to pay attention to these matters. Shen Changming's personality was completely different from his elder brother, Shen Changping, who died in the hands of Yan Bugui. The former had a righteous and unyielding personality, while the latter was very tactful and knew when the wind was blowing. He could be said to be the classic example of shameless. Chu Xiu waved his hand and said, "All right, enough with the compliments. I heard that you captured a person from the memorial manor. Did he speak ill of me? If there is such a situation again, you can just ignore it. There are plenty of people in this world who are cursing at me, Chu Xiu. It doesn't matter if he is one more person. As long as he doesn't curse in front of me, then I don't have to bother about it." Shen Changming quickly said, "My lord, this person didn't just curse at you. He even revealed some information. Back when you used the identity of Evil Dao's Lin Yi to kill the Memorial Manor's young manor lord, Nie Renlong once forcefully invited the Northern Yan's divination master, Yuan Ji, to divine your whereabouts. In the end, not only did he divine your whereabouts, but he also divined some other things about your identity. I felt that it might be useful, so I brought him here." Chu Xiu raised his eyebrows. He was very sensitive to the things that had happened to him. Upon hearing this, he immediately said, "Bring that person here." Shen Changming's face immediately lit up when he heard this. He had put in so much effort to bring that person here to claim credit. Now that Chu Xiu wanted to see that person, the credit would definitely be given. After a while, Shen Changming brought a man in his 30s who had the strength of an inborn realm expert. The moment he saw Chu Xiu, the man's eyes immediately revealed a look of horror. His body couldn't help but tremble as he constantly cursed himself in his heart. He was indeed a martial artist of the Memorial Manor, and was even a martial artist who served Nie Renlong personally. But now that Nie Renlong was dead and the Memorial Manor had been disbanded, he wasn't loyal to the point where he wanted to take revenge for Nie Renlong. However, He had gone from being the confidant of the Memorial Manor Lord to a rogue cultivator in the pugilistic world. He definitely felt that it was unfair. Therefore, when he mingled with the other rogue cultivators, he would still scold Chu Xiu. One reason was to vent his anger, and the other was to show his identity. Although a fallen phoenix was inferior to a chicken, he was still a disciple of a big sect. Under his deliberate publicity, he actually had some reputation among the rogue cultivators. Because of this, when he was scolding Chu Xiu, he would often brag about the gossip in the memorial hall. Moreover, it was precisely because he had said too much that the Shen family had overheard it and reported it to Shen Zhongming, giving him the opportunity to bring him to Chu Xiu's place. Chapter 700. Chu Xiu indifferently looked at the man and said in a calm voice, "What do you know? Say it, I don't want to waste time." The man trembled as he looked at Chu Xiu. "If I say it, can official Chu spare my life?" Chu Xiu softly said, "First, you don't have the qualifications to discuss conditions with me right now. Second, I don't even want to lie to a person like you. Do you think I will give you any promises? Third, you only need to know that if you don't say it, you will die a very ugly death. That is enough." The man's body turned cold, and he did not dare say any more nonsense. He trembled as he said, "When official Chu killed Nie Donglu, the manor master." "Oh no. Therefore, Nie Renlong wanted to search for your whereabouts. Therefore, he forcefully invited Yuan Ji, the master of divination in the land of northern Yen, to divine your whereabouts. However, there seemed to be a problem during the divination, and that Yuan Ji spat out blood on the spot. He even said that you were a person that shouldn't exist. It was very strange. As for the rest, I really don't know. Sir, just treat me like a fart and let me go." The man had a crying face. He was simply scared to death. If he really did something that angered the heavens and people and was killed, it was fine. His life would be worth it. But if he died because of his cheap mouth, he would not be willing even if he went to hell. Chu Xiu knit his brows. What did he mean by a person that shouldn't exist? Where is Yuan Ji right now? The man quickly said, "He's in West Chu." That Yuan Ji immediately escaped to West Chu after calculating Sir's whereabouts. Nie Renlong wanted to find him later, but he couldn't find him in the end. Chu Xiu thought about it for a bit. Under the man's eyes that became more and more frightened, Chu Xiu waved his hand and said, "All right, you can leave." The man immediately felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders, and hurriedly ran out. After praising Shen Zhongming, Chu Xiu thought about it for a bit. He was prepared to go to West Chu and see Yuan Ji. Chu Xiu had long wanted to study the secrets of his body, but unfortunately, he had no clue. Now that he had finally obtained some clues, Chu Xiu was also prepared to investigate. After telling Mei Qinglian and the others, Chu Xiu headed to West Chu by himself. It wasn't that he didn't want to bring others, but West Chu was not his territory, so there was no meaning in bringing this many people. Moreover, the West Chu land was a bit chaotic and it was too dangerous. If he brought too many people, it would be a burden. In the current Jianghu, the most chaotic place was West Chu. With the rise of moon-worshipping cult, Yi Xiaonan made a high-profile move, defeating the old celestial master of Mount Longhu and Sabodhi Monastery's divine monk Rama. Under the premise that Tianmen's gate master Jun Wushan didn't easily set foot in the Jianghu, and the Lord of Freedom god Zhong Shenxiu didn't show his face easily, Yi Xiaonan was the strongest existence in the Jianghu. In order to prevent the demonic path from rising again, forces like the Great Light Temple all headed west to curb the development of moon-worshipping cult. Therefore, the most chaotic place in the Jianghu was West Chu. Experts gathered, and the situation was very tense. West Chu's Jiang state capital was only a small state capital. There were no big cities in the entire West Chu. At most it was a small state capital. Jiang state capital was famous because it was close to Mount Longhu, so it was relatively famous. Most of the tourists who came to Mount Longhu or the warriors who came to the Celestial Master Mansion lived in Jiang state capital. However, with Mount Longhu sealed, whether it was the tourists who came to offer incense or the warriors who came to visit, Jiang state capital was no longer as prosperous as before. At this time, in a tavern on the streets of Jiang state capital, A group of Jianghu loose cultivators were taking shelter from the rain and resting. Westchu was humid and rainy. This kind of weather was very common. This group of loose cultivators in the Jianghu naturally did not have masters to supervise their cultivation like the warriors who came from sections. Therefore, they were too lazy to hide at home and cultivate. Instead, they were chatting about Jianghu gossip. Brothers, have you heard? Recently, moon-worshipping cult seems to be fighting with those righteous sects again. I heard that it was quite tragic. Of course I've heard of it. It's said that the high priest of the moon-worshipping cult killed a martial Dao grandmaster of the Chunyang Taoist sect with a curse. TSK, it was a tragic scene. Before the person could react, he had already become a dried corpse. However, those righteous sects are not to be trifled with. I heard that there is an old ancestor in Storm Sword Tomb who buried his sword with his body. He had originally decided to never come out of Jianghu again, and died with the sword. However, at this time, he is carrying a broken sword and has decided to come out of the mountain to exchange a few blows with Yi Xiaonan. It is the same for true martial arts cult. It is said that there is an old ancestor in true martial arts cult who has been instructed by the immortal Ning Xuanji. He is also ready to come out of seclusion. Are you serious? He has been instructed by Ning Xuanji? Isn't this person more than 500 years old? Apart from the old Taoist master, can there be such a senior in Jianghu? Who knows? However, those righteous sects must have extraordinary heritage. I am afraid that our West Chu Wulin will not be peaceful. Who cares? Recently, I have been unlucky. I am going to find Master Yuanji and see if I have provoked some dirty things. Master Yuanji's asking price is so high. Can you afford it? Recently the Taoist master's mansion has been sealed. There are fewer pilgrims and warriors. Master Yuanji's price is much cheaper than before. Just as they were chatting, a voice suddenly came. Where is the Yuanji you are talking about? As the voice came, everyone present was suddenly shocked. They did not know when a young man in a black robe with a black long saber at his waist stopped outside the tavern and looked at them. It was still raining heavily outside. However, when the raindrops fell on him, they automatically parted. It was as if the raindrops had intelligence and were deliberately avoiding him. The most shocking thing was that there wasn't a shred of aura coming from his body at all. This was what made people feel shocked. Although these Jianghu rogue cultivators were weak, they were not idiots. At a glance, they could tell that this person was an expert among experts. They quickly stood up and said respectfully, Master Yuanji is in the Taoist temple at the foot of Mount Longhu. Sir, do you need me to lead the way? Thank you, but no need. As soon as he finished speaking, the young man in a black robe took a step forward. It was as if he had shrunk the ground to an inch. In an instant, he appeared more than 30 meters away and disappeared in the rain. Everyone present breathed a sigh of relief at the same time. The pressure that such a powerhouse gave them was too great. However, everyone was a little confused. He had such a cultivation at such a young age. He should not be a nobody. Someone suddenly said loudly, I remember. He is Chu Xiu of the Yinma lineage. However, I heard that he is now cooperating with the Northern Yen court and established the Martial Suppression Hall to suppress the Northern Yen martial arts world. Moreover, he has just repelled several major sword sects in Wei County. What is he doing in West Chu? From the top of the Longhu list to the top of the martial list, Chu Xiu was no longer a nobody. In a situation where he did not deliberately hide his appearance, it was normal for him to be recognized. Several people in the tavern looked at each other and shook their heads. These people were more concerned about the Jianghu gossip. They roughly knew the relationship between Chu Xiu's Yinma lineage and the moon-worshipping cult. Therefore, although they were all people of the demonic path, Chu Xiu's demons were different from the moon-worshipping cult's demons. Now that Chu Xiu appeared here, it gave them a feeling that West Chu's Jianghu was more chaotic. Of course, no matter how chaotic it had nothing to do with the lowest-level rogue cultivators in Jianghu. At most, it would give them something to talk about. At this time, Chu Xiu also headed in the direction of Longhu Mountain after getting the exact news from Yuanji. In fact, in the tavern, Chu Xiu appeared after listening to them talking about the Jianghu gossip for a long time. Although Chu Xiu had already inquired about West Chu before coming, the situation in West Chu was constantly changing. The things that Chu Xiu had inquired about were naturally not as clear as the local tyrants in West Chu. He did not expect that the situation in West Chu's Jianghu had become so intense. All the major sects had almost taken out their trump cards. It was as if the Second Righteous Demon War was about to break out. However, this had nothing to do with him. In fact, he still hoped that the moon-worshipping cult could continue to be strong. Without the moon-worshipping cult to attract the firepower on the surface, the martial artists from the Yinma lineage would not be so relaxed. There were many Taoist temples at the foot of Mount Longhu. These Taoist temples did not belong to the Celestial Master Mansion of Mount Longhu, but they were also close to the Taoist sects of the Celestial Master Mansion. Opening a Taoist temple here meant that they were close to the Celestial Master Mansion, and even submitted to the Celestial Master Mansion. Yuanji's Taoist temple was among these Taoist temples, and it was very famous. Although his strength was not very good, Yuanji's divination skills were absolutely superb. In northern Yan, where there were very few Taoist martial artists, he was the #1 divination master. Even if there were countless Taoist martial artists around the Celestial Master Mansion, he was still the same. Even after coming to West Chu, Yuanji had received an invitation from the Celestial Master Manor to exchange insights on the divination technique inside the Celestial Master Manor. Yuanji's Taoist temple did not have a name. There were only 8 words written on the Taoist temple's plaque. 3 days of planning, no mistake. This sentence was extremely arrogant, but it had been hanging for so long without being taken down. This was also his ability. At this time in the Taoist temple, Yuanji was frowning and drinking tea. It was raining heavily outside, and the Celestial Master Mansion had begun to close the mountain. His business was not good. Normally, Yuanji would close the Taoist temple and find his concubines to fool around with. He wanted to see if he could create a villain to break the fate of his lineage of 5 imperfections and 3 imperfections. But today, for some reason, there was always a restless feeling lingering in his heart. He put down the teacup in annoyance and wanted to divine what had happened. At this moment, a voice suddenly came from outside the Taoist temple. "Master Yuanji, are you going to divine for yourself to see if there will be a bloody disaster today?" You're tuning in to the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.